Mr. Speaker.
The Minister of Finance.
I wish to.
Mr. Samuda.
I wish to.
The Minister of Finance requested a withdrawal, and
Mr. Speaker, I wish to.
Find out, could you straighten it out with them, please?
I wish to have a recommittal of the item announcements and the item notices of motion given orally.
Those in favor? Aye. Those against? Yes, have it. Announcements.
Yeah.
Members, you have to participate. You have to listen.
Also laid on the table of the House today are the following: the Public Procurement Reconsideration and Review Regulations 2018 and the Public Procurement Reconsideration and Review Regulations 2018 under the Public Procurement Act, and the Public Procurement Regulations Resolution 2018 under the Public Procurement Act.
Notice of motion given orally.
That at the next meeting of the House, I will move the following two motions. The Emergency Powers Act, Emergency Powers number 2, continuation or continuance number 2, Resolution 2018. Whereas by virtue of Section 21 and 2B of the Constitution of Jamaica, the Governor-General may make a proclamation declaring that a state of public emergency exists if satisfied that action has been taken or is immediately threatened by any person or body of persons of such nature and on such extensive a scale as to likely to endanger public safety. And whereas the Governor-General was satisfied that the state of public emergency existed as a result of the aforementioned circumstances, and whereas on the 18th day of March 2018, the Governor-General by proclamation declared that a state of public emergency exists in the areas of the parish of St. Catherine specified in the schedule to the proclamation, and further declared that the said proclamation shall, unless previously revoked, remain in force for 14 days or for such longer period not exceeding 3 months, as the Houses of Parliament may determine by a resolution supported by a 2/3 majority of all members of each House. And whereas it is provided by Section 23 of the Constitution of Jamaica that a proclamation made by the Governor-General for the purposes of and in accordance with the section shall, unless previously revoked, remain in force for 14 days or such longer period, not exceeding 3 months, as both Houses of Parliament may determine by resolution supported by a 2/3 majority of all members of each House. And whereas under the provisions of Section 3(1) of the Emergency Powers Act, it is lawful for the Governor-General, during a state of public emergency, by order, to make regulation for securing the essentials of life to the community. And whereas the Governor-General, in exercise of the powers conferred upon him by Section 3(1) of the Emergency Powers Act, made the Emergency Powers number 2 Regulations 2018 for securing the essentials of life to the specified areas of the parish of St. Catherine during the state of public emergency. And whereas Section 3(4) of the Emergency Powers Act provides that any regulation so made be laid before the Senate and House of Representatives as soon as may be after they are made, and shall not come into force after the expiration of 7 days from the time they are so laid before the Senate and the House of Representatives, whichever shall be later, unless a resolution is passed by the Senate and the House of Representatives providing for the continuance thereof. And whereas the state of emergency number 2 regulation 2018 were laid in the House of Representatives on the 27th day of March 2018 and in the Senate on the 29th day of March 2018. And whereas it was resolved by both Houses of Parliament that the state of public emergency declared as aforesaid, the Emergency Powers number 2 regulations remain and continue in force until the 3rd day of July 2018. And whereas it is desirable that a state of public emergency declared as aforementioned should remain in force for a period of 3 months until the 2nd day of October 2018, and B, the Emergency Powers number 2 regulations 2018 continue in force after the expiration of 7 days from the time of the latter laying as aforesaid, and until the expiration of the state of public emergency. Now therefore be it resolved by this Honourable House as follows. 1. This resolution may be cited as the Emergency Powers number 2 continuance number 2 resolution 2018. 2. The state of public emergency declared by the Governor General by proclamation on the 18th day of March 2018 shall remain in force for a period of 3 months until the 2nd day of October 2018. And 3. The Emergency Powers number 2 regulations are hereby continued in force until the 2nd day of October 2018 with the following alterations. A. In Regulation 32, insert next after the words, the Minister, the words, on the written advice of the Chief of Defence Staff and the Commissioner of Police. And B, in Regulation 33, insert 1 in paragraph 1, next after the words, the Minister, and 2 in paragraph 3, next after the words, the Minister may. The words, on the written advice of the Chief of Defence Staff and the Commissioner of Police. Mr. Speaker, I now move to the second extension resolution. The Emergency Powers Act, the Emergency Powers Continuance number 3, Resolution 2018. Whereas by virtue of Section 21 and 2B of the Constitution of Jamaica, the Governor General may make a proclamation declaring that a state of public emergency exists if satisfied that action has been taken or is immediately threatened by any person or body of persons of such a nature and on so extensive a scale as to be likely to endanger public safety. And whereas the Governor General was satisfied that a state of public emergency existed as a result of the aforementioned circumstances. And whereas on the 18th day of January 2018, the Governor General by proclamation declared that a state of public emergency exists in the parish of St. James, and further declared that the said proclamation shall, unless previously revoked, remain in force for 14 days, or for such longer period, not exceeding 3 months, as both Houses of Parliament may determine by a resolution, supported by 2/3 majority of all members of each House. And whereas it is provided by Section 23 of the Constitution of Jamaica that a proclamation made by the Governor General for the purposes and in accordance with that section shall, unless previously revoked, remain in force for 14 days or for such longer period not exceeding 3 months, as both Houses of Parliament may determine by a resolution supported by 2/3 majority of all the members of each House. And whereas under provisions of Section 3(1) of the Emergency Powers Act, it is lawful for the Governor-General during a state of public emergency by order to make regulations for securing essentials of life to the community. And whereas the Governor-General, in exercise of the powers conferred upon him by Section 3(1) of the Emergency Powers Act, made the Emergency Powers Regulations 2018 for securing the essentials of life to the parish of St. James during the state of public emergency. And whereas Section 3(4) of the Emergency Powers Act provides that any regulation so made shall be laid before the Senate and the House of Representatives as soon as may be after they are made, and shall not continue in force after the expiration of 7 days from the time they are so laid before the Senate and the House of Representatives, whichever shall be the latter, unless a resolution is passed by the Senate and House of Representatives, providing for the continuance thereof. And whereas the Emergency Powers Regulation 2018 were laid in the House of Representatives on the 23rd day of January 2018 and in the Senate on the 26th day of January 2018. And whereas it was resolved by both Houses of Parliament that the state of public emergency declared as aforesaid and the Emergency Powers Regulation 2018 remain and continue in force until the 2nd day of May 2018. And whereas it was thereafter resolved by the Houses of Parliament that the state of public emergency declared as aforesaid and the Emergency Powers Regulation 2018 remain and continue in force for a period of 3 months until the 2nd day of August 2018. And whereas it is desirable that the state of public emergency declared as aforementioned should remain in force for a further period of 3 months until the 1st day of November 2018. And B, the Emergency Powers Regulation 2018 continue in force until the expiration of the state of emergency. Now, therefore, be it resolved by this Honourable House as follows. 1. This resolution may be cited as the Emergency Powers Continuance Number 3 Resolution 2018. 2. The state of public emergency declared by the Governor-General by proclamation on the 18th day of January 2018 shall remain in force for a period of 3 months until the 1st day of November 2018. And 3. The Emergency Powers Regulations 2018 are hereby continued in force until the 1st day of November 2018. Mr. Speaker, I further beg to give notice that at a later stage today, I will move for the suspension of standing orders to enable me to take these motions, notice of which I just gave.
Mr. Speaker, I beg to give notice at the next meeting of the House. I'll move the following motions. The Public Procurement Regulations Resolution 2018. Whereas by virtue of Section 60, subsection 1 of the Public Procurement Act, hereinafter referred to as the Act, the Minister may make such regulations as he thinks fit to give full effect to the provisions of the Act, and without prejudice to the foregoing, regulations may prescribe provisions in relation to matters specified in paragraphs A to J of Section 60, subsection 1. And whereas on the 25th day of June 2018, the Minister made the Public Procurement Regulations 2018, and whereas it is provided by Section 60, subsection 2 of the Act, that regulations made under paragraphs A, C, E, F, and G of Section 60, subsection 1 of the Act shall be subject to affirmative resolution. Now, therefore, be it resolved by this Honourable House as follows. This resolution may be cited as the Public Procurement Regulations Resolution 2018 to the Public Regulations 2018 are hereby confirmed. And Mr. Speaker, the second resolution, the Public Procurement Reconsideration and Review Regulations Resolution 2018. Whereas by virtue of Section 60, subsection 1 of the Public Procurement Act, hereinafter referred to as the Act, the Minister may make such regulations as he thinks fit to give full effect to the provisions of the Act, and without prejudice to the foregoing, regulations may prescribe provisions in relation to matters specified in paragraphs A to J of Section 60, subsection 1, and whereas on the 25th day of June 2018, the Minister made the Public Procurement Reconsideration and Review Regulations 2018, and whereas it is provided by Section 60, subsection 2 of the Act that the regulations made under paragraphs A, C, E, F, and G of Section 60, subsection 1 of the Act shall be subject to affirmative resolution. Now, therefore, be it resolved by this Honourable House as follows. 1. The resolution may be cited as the Public Procurement Reconsideration and Review Regulations 2018, Regulations Resolution 2018, and 2. The Public Procurement Reconsideration and Review Regulations 2018 are hereby affirmed.
Mr. Speaker, I wish to request suspension of standing orders to enable me to take the motion, notice of which I gave earlier, with respect to the member who will join the PAAC. And then I would like to I'd like you to invite the Prime Minister to take the motion, notice of which he gave earlier. Mr. Speaker, with respect to the, well, I asked for the suspension, so you asked for a vote.
Those in favour? Those against?
Mr. Speaker, the member.
Mr. Samudo.
Yes.
Please advise the Prime Minister.
The addition to the PAAC of the member from Eastern St. Catherine is what is before the House to be supported in accordance with the established convention. In that way, it brings that committee to its full membership. And I'm sure that the leader of opposition business will be very happy because he has been nagging my soul for the last 2 months and accusing us of all sorts of things, not giving him the opportunity to have his full membership. Now he has his full slate, but I hope he will use this increase in a manner that is responsible and not sought to disrupt the smooth running of the PAAC. So, Mr. Speaker, with that I ask that the House approves this motion.
Those in favour? Those against? The ayes have it. Prime Minister, your time.
Mr. Speaker, I now move for the suspension of standing orders to enable me to take the motion, notice of which I gave earlier. Two motions, to be clear, Mr. Speaker. Notice of which I gave earlier.
Those in favour? Those against? Ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, before the Prime Minister proceeds, I think we would prefer and decide if he dealt with each motion separately, meaning St. Catherine, which quite frankly we are prepared to support now, but on St. James, the matter, the current extension ends in August. And we are prepared to come back in July to discuss that, and for reasons which I will explain if he brings it. But we would like them to be treated as separate motions, and I would propose that we deal with St. Catherine first.
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, before I begin my presentation and in response to the position placed to this House by the Leader of the Opposition, the government considered it a prudent use of parliamentary time to debate both extensions concurrently. Mr. Speaker, it is the tradition of this House where August is usually a few weeks in August, recess. And that has been since I have been a member of Parliament, which is not as long as many persons here, but we came in together. Yes, yes. But August has traditionally been the month of recess. And notwithstanding that recess, the tradition of the recess, does not mean that the House cannot be called back. And if there is a matter of urgency, and it is an undertaking by, we are in June, yes. Well, Mr. Speaker, this is the public's house, and a public undertaking has been given. I have no difficulty, Mr. Speaker, in saying that we take the opposition at their word, that they are prepared to debate at some point in July the extension motion that will be brought for St. James. Mr. Speaker,
Mr. Speaker, we have always contended that the matter of an emergency, of emergency powers, are just that, emergency powers. Not to be treated lightly, not to be made routine, and deserving of careful consideration. We have scarcely had a period of a third of the time elapse in relation to the last extension. The circumstances which warrant an extension are to be considered carefully by us all. And even if a matter of convenience is raised, we must always remember that we are, in fact, exercising tremendous power over people's rights. And given that consideration, we don't want to treat it routinely. Without entering into the debate now, we have asked in this House whether we could get data regarding the extent to which gangs are in fact being dismantled. What is the progress towards an end of the situation? What is the prognosis of the intelligence services to be shared with this House and with the members of this House so that we can make a decision? Quite frankly, Mr. Speaker, and again, I don't want to introduce a side issue. If we had, for example, the Internal and External Affairs Committee constituted and meeting, it would have provided an opportunity for the heads of the security forces to come in camera if need be and speak to members of the House about what is happening. But we don't want to, we in the opposition don't want to fall in the position where we served notice last time that we don't want to be just making emergency powers become routine, nor do we want to become a rubber stamp, nor do we want to be obstructionist. I give the undertaking that we are prepared to debate this in June. We are prepared in July. But I am also asking if the kind of analysis that we are seeking, not as a gambit, not as a kind of, nor as an ultimatum, nor as anything, just as participants in the House, as guardians of people's rights, as protectors of the Constitution, could we get the information and not be treated to this kind of approach, which says on the day before we want to discuss the extension. We don't think that it is appropriate for the weighty powers of the state of emergency to be dealt with in this way. We recognize that the St. Catherine situation, which expires on next week, will have to be treated differently. There are some who have deep concerns, and they'll no doubt express them. But we are prepared to move on that. But on the other matter, having served notice before, we just can't come here and be told that we must do it.
Mr. Speaker, as I stand here today, I'm certain that all members of this House would be bemoaning the fact that Jamaica is again all over the world media for the brutal slaying of an elderly British Jamaican couple in Portland. We also bemoan the other recent incidents that have led to loss of life and injuries. Mr. Speaker, the last time I stood in this House to ask for the extension of the zones of special operations, the member from Westmoreland, Western Westmoreland, pointed out a terrible situation in his constituency, and he himself would have suffered the loss of someone close to him. And I undertook, Mr. Speaker, to give special attention to Grange Hill. I wish to report to the House and to the member, Mr. Speaker, that the Jamaica Social Investment Fund has started, and I don't know if they have contacted you as yet, but they have started to do the preliminary work necessary to make an intervention, significant intervention in Grange Hill. Mr. Speaker, crime continues to undermine Jamaica's growth. It is recognized and accepted that crime is the most serious challenge facing our country. Unfortunately, as was reiterated by the Minister of National Security in his sectoral presentation, violence has become a tool of choice for many, and there is new evidence of suffering every day resulting from this choice. It has become an epidemic. Our gangs are organized and systematic with focused and targeted approaches. Minister Chang outlined the operational strategies and institutional changes, policy enhancements, and legislative amendments that are in train. Today, Mr. Speaker, I am again asking this Honourable House to unite in continuing the states of public emergency in St. Catherine. And though we will not require a vote on St. James, I am asking the House to consider approving the extension when we agree to debate it in July. Mr. Speaker, we need additional time to make further progress to ensure that the results will be lasting and positive in the lives of the Jamaican citizens. Mr. Speaker, some time ago, the now opposition, then the government, had a slogan, and the slogan was, "Don't stop the progress." So today, Mr. Speaker, I appeal to the conscience of the opposition. Don't stop the progress that we are making. Mr. Speaker, this Honourable House will recall that on the 18th of March 2018, His Excellency, the Governor-General declared a state of public emergency in the St. Catherine North Police Division for a period not exceeding 14 days. This enhanced security measure was found to be necessary and an important step in fighting crime, and was echoed in this House as being one of the most demonstrative policy of the government's commitment to providing a safer environment for Jamaicans. On the 27th of March, the state of public emergency was approved for extension for a period of 3 months, which expires, Mr. Speaker, on the 3rd of July 2018. Mr. Speaker, prior to the state of public emergency, the St. Catherine North Division had recorded the highest number of homicides for the year, with 49 persons being killed between the 1st of January to the 17th of March 2018. There was an increase in both murders and shooting incidents when compared with the same period in 2017, where 29 murders and 28 shooting incidents occurred. In fact, the division accounted for 134, or 8%, of the 1,616 murders that were committed across the island last year, 2017. Additionally, of note, prior to the state of public emergency, crime was on the increase in several communities within the divisions, such as Ellerslie Pen, Capture Land, Jones Avenue, Spanish Town, the Spanish Town Centre itself, De La Vega City, March Pen, Brooklyn, Thompson Pen, and Victoria District. This reality had the impact of reducing the quality of life of the citizens of these communities and reflected an unacceptable state. Mr. Speaker, as a nation, we must refuse to accept that citizens must live in daily fear as if it were a normal part of their existence. It was for these reasons that the declaration was necessary, to equip the security forces with extraordinary powers to better enable them to stem high crime levels in the St. Catherine North Division. Mr. Speaker, to date, we have welcomed the results that have thus far been achieved through this measure. Since the declaration of the state of public emergency, the St. Catherine North Division has experienced a 26% reduction in incidents of both murders and shootings. For the period covering the 18th of March to the 18th of July, the division recorded 14 murders and 10 shootings. This, while still unacceptable, it is a significant reduction when compared with the 93-day figure prior to the state of public emergency declaration, when 53 murders and 38 shootings were committed. Traditional hotspots, including Spanish Town and its environs, have experienced a significant reduction, not only in murders and shootings, but have also experienced a reduction in illegal activities such as extortion. And that is the truth. This has encouraged a commercially friendly environment for business and consumers. Additionally, detentions have helped to disrupt criminal activities. And to this end, the security forces have also been able to conduct fundamental policing activities. In fact, the presence, activities, and influence of the security forces have not only curtailed gang influence, but have also acted as a further deterrent to the commission of crimes in public spaces. It has also brought back a sense of law and order in communities. While the state of public emergency, Mr. Speaker, is not meant to be a permanent feature, it has undoubtedly improved the quality of life of the citizens who live in those areas where the state of emergency has been in effect. These declarations have allowed the security forces to conduct operations designed to target and disrupt gangs and organized criminal networks, apprehend persons, seize illegal weapons, ammunition, and narcotics, to target the proceeds of illegal activities, to deter extortion, and reduce the dominance and freedom of movement of criminal suspects, and, Mr. Speaker, to establish firmly public order and the rule of law. Mr. Speaker, the security forces continue to work within a comprehensive all-of-government approach as the intelligence and operational objectives are being pursued, with particular reference to tracing the proceeds of crime and the movement of illicit funds. The joint leveraging of the capabilities of other government organizations have been indispensable in the provision of an information-rich intelligence picture. The achievements thus far are only the beginning and have motivated efforts to ensure that we never revert to the high levels of crime that we have been experiencing for several decades. Recognizing the positive impacts of the state of public emergency, the security forces are continuing their efforts. It is imperative that the current strategy be pursued for a further defined period. The following objectives will remain the focus of the operations: to eradicate the threat to democratic governance posed by organized crime. Mr. Speaker, we have not placed this objective in the public domain before, but I've used very diplomatic terms to convey the idea. Particularly in the North St. Catherine Division, there exists organized criminality, Mr. Speaker, that has historically had connections politically and has, Mr. Speaker, the potential and the ability to influence and corrupt government. And it is therefore, Mr. Speaker, a strategic direction that that gang in particular, well, Mr. Speaker, we can say those gangs because, you know, Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I've really tried to be very balanced with the facts. And I don't want to depart from it. You understand what I'm about. I don't want to depart from it because there are some facts that could be placed on the table. But you know, it is better that we deal with these issues in a way that does not allow for a political divide on a very serious matter. So, Mr. Speaker, that is one of the strategic objectives. Mr. Speaker, we have to continue to be strategic in the conduct of searches for arms. Mr. Speaker, we have been fairly successful in the discovery of weapons. And I'm certain that this year you will see an increase in the weapons find over last year. And it is primarily because the security forces have been very surgical in how they have conducted their operations. They have been intelligence-driven, and the existence of the state of emergency has seen an increase in the provision of information leading to the recovery of illegal weapons. And we need to have that continue so that we can disarm the gangs. And Mr. Speaker, let's be clear. Yes, we are finding one gun here and one gun there, but you will see, the record will show that we are having multiple finds, up to 9 and 10. So, Mr. Speaker, the strategy is working. Mr. Speaker, we need to create the conditions for community policing. We tend to talk about policy sometimes in a vacuum. So, Mr. Speaker, you will hear, well, what the police needs to do is community policing. Community policing is very difficult to do when a community is captured by criminals. The efforts of the police in community policing will be for naught if people don't cooperate, don't receive you. So, in order for this strategy, which is internationally recognized as best policing practice, to work, there has to be the fundamentals, which is that the citizen is free to relate to the police. And the state of public emergency, zones of special operation, help to create that atmosphere, that environment where the citizen can relate to the police without fear. That needs to be established, and that is not something that is established overnight. We need to continue with the state of public emergency. Mr. Speaker, another objective is to re-establish legitimate community structures. Mr. Speaker, I don't want to digress too much, but I'm certain that the leader of the opposition, who by virtue of his speeches that I have read and analyzed, I would describe him as a statist. He believes in a strong state. And I've read many of his speeches, and you could see from what he's saying that he believes in the strengthening of the Jamaican state. I too, Mr. Speaker, believe in a strong state. There's no way that any country can progress, can achieve prosperity without the state being strong. And too often, Mr. Speaker, we allow events to happen that weaken our state. Allowing gangs to exist and flourish in communities weaken the state. When gangs get power to the point where citizens depend on them for dispensing justice, for sending their children to school, for determining who gets work and who doesn't, for security, then the next step is for them to say, I will rent your house and collect the rent for you. Or they will go to another step, which is to say, send me your daughter today. No, I agree that they're doing that. I'm making a point to show you that when the state allows gangs to exist and citizens to rely on them for basic protection and security, then what we are doing is to allow parallel states to exist. In that event, the government of Jamaica could not say that it is the sovereign state because it does not have a monopoly on law and order. That's a dangerous thing to allow to happen. And for many decades, we have allowed this to happen. And I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, that we are at the point now where the
20 seek permission to allow the house to sit.
Mr. Speaker, the time being 7:21, I ask that the House be allowed to sit beyond 7:30 to complete the business of the day.
The question is, at the time being 7:20, the House be allowed to sit beyond 7:30 to complete its business of the day. Those in favor? Those against? The ayes have it. Prime Minister, proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish you had played the advantage and allowed me to continue in flight. But, Mr. Speaker, I well understand the rules of the House. But the point, I believe, is well made, that we need the continuation of the state of emergency. You know, we have to move with technology. Mr. Speaker, the state of public emergency is helping to restore the legitimacy of the government, and it is helping to restore legitimate organizations in communities. You will see the resurgence of citizens associations. You will see the resurgence of youth groups, and you will see community leaders who are genuine leaders taking charge of their community because they no longer have the threat of a Don over them. Mr. Speaker, peace is an important commodity. And we tend not to look at the exercise of public authority in the sense that one of its main duty is to ensure that the citizen can live in peace. Mr. Speaker, if you were to take some communities in Jamaica and, let's say, compare them to a community in a war-torn country, you may not be shocked, as well as you may be shocked, to see that the risk of them losing their lives would be about the same or probably higher in Jamaica. Mr. Speaker, there are countries that are at war where the homicide rate, even if you were to take in the casualties of war, is less than, on a per capita basis, than Jamaica. So, Mr. Speaker, the level of violence that we have in the country and the extreme expression of violence, the taking of life, we have accepted almost as a new normal. We have accepted it as if this is how things are. Mr. Speaker, this is not how things should be. And this government is determined to ensure that if we do nothing else, that we break the informal institutions that have developed in the country that support the level of criminality and violence that takes away the peace of the citizens. Mr. Speaker, I hear the pleadings of the leader of the opposition and indeed many of the members on that side regarding information. We need information, and maybe the internal-external committee of Parliament should meet. And I don't dispute that, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, there should be. But I want us, Mr. Speaker, to appreciate that where we are in this fight against crime, that there has to be an understanding of how information and intelligence is shared across government and the opposition. I tried to introduce a mechanism, Mr. Speaker, by having a representative from the opposition sit on the National Security Council. I believe that there is still some refinement to go, and there is a little hurdle that I think we need to cross. Eventually, hopefully, we will reach that level of maturity one day where we can cross that little hurdle. But I want the leader of the opposition to appreciate that it has not escaped me that there has to be a trusted mechanism for the opposition to be informed about some of the strategic things that we can't openly discuss here. So, and that is why I've invited someone to sit on the National Security Council, because the truth is that, governments change, but the long-term policies, you want them to be institutionalized. And the only way that they are continued is when both parties have the understanding of what it is that we are trying to achieve. So I want to assure the leader of the opposition there's no attempt to have any asymmetry in information. But we have to also accept that we have to be very careful with everything that we discuss. We cannot be naive to believe that the criminals are just corner men. Mr. Speaker, the next phase of our operations is not so much now to go and detain the corner men. The next phase of the operation now is to use the space created, the peace created, the networks that we have uprooted to get to the masterminds, to get to the kingpins, to get to those persons who have the means to put together 120 firearms, to have the connections, to have those firearms be packaged and placed on a port in the United States to be destined for Jamaica. There's no corner man do that. It's not a corner man do that. It's not a corner man that is able to get on a boat and go to Costa Rica or Nicaragua and load it up and come back. So, Mr. Speaker, where we are now is, you may say, well, where are the operations within the state of emergency areas? The operations are continuing, Mr. Speaker, but they are of a different nature now. We are into a different phase, and you will start to see the impact of those in months to come. So, Mr. Speaker, I wish to assure this House that, it's not just using the state of emergency for a lull. There is a strategic plan, and the objective is to truly degrade, uproot, disrupt, and destroy the criminal networks permanently. That is the objective, and I am enlisting the support of every single member of this House in this campaign. Mr. Speaker, I can only close my presentation by saying to this House, don't stop the progress.
Dr. Phillips.
Mr. Speaker, I think we can all agree that we shouldn't stop the progress. I think it is also the case that it is also the case. Move this down a little. It is also the case, Mr.
Sorry, are you hearing me? All right?
I am hearing you now.
Okay.
Are you seeing me now? Okay, wonderful. Okay, can you hear me now? Okay, good. Mr. Speaker, the next line said solid achievements. I think if we do a little reprise of the past, we would also remember Operation Kingfish, which was both named and designed to highlight the very issues that the Prime Minister is addressing. Namely, that if we are to effectively confront criminality, you can't focus on the so-called sprats, what he called the corner man, but that you have to get to the kingfish, the big men, the centers of organized crime. There should be no doubt about the commitment of the opposition to eliminating organized crime, nor should there be any doubt as to the commitment to reducing violent crime generally. The issues that arise, and I think our record is clear, because, Jamaica has passed through a very tortured experience over many decades where crime is concerned. There was once a time when militias emanating from the South American continent used to strut across our north coast. The so-called Colombians were a big force in Jamaican life. There was a time when the estimate was that 20% of the cocaine leaving Colombia came through Jamaica's coastline, onshore and offshore, and found its way to North America and Europe, and we were able to cauterize that, reverse it, and it was during PNP administrations. Perhaps one of the important lessons from all of that, and from the elimination of the central gangs that were involved in the 2010 extradition issue. Don't want to rehash it. but that was part of this effort to eliminate organized crime in the country. And perhaps the lesson that we should draw is that there is need for continuity of effort. Because, and if there was that need, again, we don't want to necessarily bring up unpleasant things, we should never have raised the specter of political competition over that fight as occurred during the 2016 election campaign. Who asked that question? You? Okay. Because you don't really want me to go there, and I don't, mindful of the effort that the Prime Minister says he's making about finding common ground. I don't think you want to go down there. No, you never asked that question. Mr. Speaker, we are supporting this extension in St. Catherine North. The objective of fighting crime is not in doubt. Where we can have, nor is there any doubt about the fact that the declaration of a state of emergency can be a legitimate tool in the toolbox which the country uses to confront crime. We are of the view that it is a tool to be used only in the most extreme of circumstances. And it is a tool that ought not to become routinized. And we are told that we share views on that. In order to be assured, however, and that it won't be routinized, and that a time will come when we don't need to rely on it, then there is need for some information as to the progress being made that we must not stop. And this is where we believe there can be a legitimate focus of a debate and discussion. It is as if we acknowledge and accept that murders are down in the zones where the state of emergency has been declared. We accept also that other elements of crime are down. What we need to know, and the Prime Minister says it is happening, but they say trust. I think it was President Reagan, he said trust, but verify. And we need to be able to verify that to what extent are these measures leading us toward a sustained solution of the crime problem, not only in those communities, but in the country as a whole. Are we like the patient who is in pain and we are giving morphine, but eventually, if we are not careful and with the dispensing of the drugs, that the patient is not going to become addicted to the deleterious drugs? No, I understand that he's giving a checkup to the West Portland MP later, so I don't want to proceed with the medical analogy. But on a serious point, we need to be assured, to be very practical, that this reduction is not just due to the fact that we have blanketed the areas with large numbers of security personnel, but that there is no actual progress with the dismantling of criminal organizations. We accept that the criminal organizations in many parts of the country, and including parts of St. Catherine, have had political connections in various ways, but let no one convey the view that these connections flow only one way. In fact, I believe it has been demonstrated on this side that successive ministers of security have been prepared to act against any criminal despite proclaimed, apparent, real, or otherwise purported connections to the People's National Party. That is on the record. But we need to know, the country needs to know what progress is being made to dismantle these gangs. How many of the, you don't have to give us specific information on James Johnson or Thomas Hardy. Or Jujux, or any particular person, but we need to know how many of the gang members known to intelligence have been detained. What is the prospect? What is the prospect of charges being brought against them, whether under proceeds of crime, anti-gang legislation, or some other bit of legislation designed to confront criminal activity? These are the things that we actually need to know. How close are we to coming to the point when we can envisage a return to some normal civil activity in the communities affected? Because make no doubt about it, Mr. Speaker, while the numbers on the reduction is real, there is also real pain being experienced by ordinary citizens. The person operating the cold supper shop, the person operating the bar, who is being told that they must lock it down while the bigger businesses get the freedom to operate. These are real concerns, and that is because there are real powers that we are using to take away the rights of the ordinary citizen. And when they confront the security forces day after day, understand that there are moments when the friction is great, and it is our responsibility to ensure that this friction is not something that is going to be of unending duration. And I tell you why. Because in a state of emergency or outside a state of emergency, despite the improvements that have occurred, there is a certain culture that has seeped in over many years in sections of our security forces which treats the ordinary citizen as somebody to be dealt with a strong hand. And therefore, there is much complaint on the corner, much complaint on the street, much complaint by the ordinary Jamaican, and it is not good for us to have these complaints persist without any prospect of a foreseeable end. And the operative word here is foreseeable. We don't need a date, but we need clear signposts of progress, since it's a word that I think is creeping into your lexicon. Prime Minister, progress. Repeat after me. Yes. So, Mr. Speaker, we are anxious to resist crime, and we are anxious to see the signposts of progress. We are anxious to know the signposts of progress that the government is using to guide itself in this regard. What we want is a long-term solution. And I just allude to the collective experience of the country. At a point in time, the Suppression of Crime Act was passed during a period of upsurge in the 1970s. That act basically empowered the police and the security forces, the JDF at the time, to be able to dispense with what were the normal protections provided for in the Constitution, for getting access to people's residences, for detention. It persisted through the 1980s with a different administration until it was repealed in the 90s. But in that period, a pattern of behavior had developed in the security forces, which I would suggest set back the basic cooperative disposition that is needed between citizen and security forces if we are going to seriously confront crime. Because in the end, even with electronic surveillance, even with increased mobility, even with an effective strategic plan, we will never be able to successfully isolate the criminal and mobilize the population unless there is trust between the security forces and the population as a whole, the decent, law-abiding citizens of the country. And so, Mr. Speaker, we are minded to support this. But again, we ask for clear indications from the government, not the day before the bill is coming to the Parliament, but well before, that we can understand what progress is being made and not what end view is in sight. We don't need a date, but we need something that gives an indication that the suspension of rights is not going to be of long duration in the country, and that, in fact, there is real progress in dismantling organized crime. Because up to now, is only the friars are being detained. Only the sprat are being detained in these states of emergency, and no kingfish have been brought to book as far as we know. Yet, and to make a further point, I accept for North St. Catherine, and I accept for St. James that there has been a positive effect. But in the rest of the country, what we are seeing is that criminals act with impunity against who they will. 2 chains from King's House back gate at the Mayfair Hotel. A father is murdered in midday on a Sunday afternoon when most people should be cruising and enjoying life. In the middle day in Clarendon, a contractor inspecting his work sites is gunned down. A Jamaican who loves his country and come back with his wife to settle in retirement here is gunned down with impunity, damaging our country's reputation overseas. These things don't give us the impression, quite frankly, that we are getting on top of the overall problem. So, Mr. Speaker, we accept the Prime Minister at his word, but we are asking again for information that will enable the House, whether in committee, to be able to make these judgments, or for some dialogue affecting the House. We think the committee system is the best thing. I appreciate the efforts made in relation to having the opposition spokesman on the National Security Council. But again, what we really need is for some indication of an end point, not for the state of emergency, but some success points that will give us confidence that it is not the intention to have this being a repeated activity in this House, and that until kingdom come, we are going to be called upon to just extend the states of emergency. We will go forward now. We will have a debate on the St. James matter, but we are insisting that we should, no, we are dealing with St. Catherine. We are committing to a debate in July, but we are insisting in the meantime that information be forthcoming that will enable us not to buy a puss in a bag, so to speak. Nobody wants to stop the progress. We want to be assured of real progress and solid achievements.
Mr. Speaker, I just have a few comments, and really to reiterate a few points made by the leader of the opposition. The reduction of crime is the business, the interest of all of us. Our communities are affected, people who we know directly or indirectly. So we have a collective interest in seeing a reduction in crime. But that reduction must have cooperation. And quite frankly, Prime Minister, what is a little bit awkward is that what we'll be saying here now, we have said it a couple of times before, and nothing changed. That undermines confidence. As I said to the Minister of National Security on the weekend when he brought it to my attention, we want to cooperate with the government, but we can't cooperate blindly. And all we have asked for is information to allow us to assess where we are. For example, the number of persons detained, arrested, charged, the amount of guns seized, etc. And there are some aspects of it which I won't even speak publicly about, which I have raised with the Minister of National Security, that is of concern to me, based on some information that have come to my attention, which we would want to be addressed so that going forward, when the state of emergency comes to an end, because we all agree it is not a permanent or long-term arrangement, but we want to know that when it comes to an end, the community do not return to that fearful state. Because, Prime Minister, it's not just the number of murders that is critical. It is the level of fear that exists in these communities. Result from the murders, result from the shooting, and the presence of these criminal elements. Those are what we want the community to have a sense that these are being addressed. We want the state of emergency to bring that situation about. And, Mr. Prime Minister, what really given me a challenge is that I've seen, use the Westmoreland situation, for example, when those 18 shootings took place with 7 fatalities, the police went in, and the kind of successful operation that they had then, there was no state of emergency in Westmoreland. We have the case in Clarendon, where we have a heightened level of murders and shootings, right? Is it that we cannot deal with the situation without a state of emergency? That's the kind of disconnect. And many persons who the leader of the opposition referred to who are suffering. When I went to St. James earlier this year, when we had the state of emergency, that was the cry of the small business operators. Their stores are locked. First it was 6 o'clock, then it moved to 7 o'clock in the evening. And then they see the bigger business can operate. They now feel that they are not being catered for. These are some of the things which, quite frankly, Prime Minister, I want to put forward, that even as we extend St. Catherine to look at adjusting some of those provisions within the regulation, that those persons who are injured, who are supporting us, supporting the state, supporting the trust for reduction, that they can feel less injured. Another point in case in point, Prime Minister, that operation in Old Harbour recently, we're over $30 million. You mentioned about up to $85 million in cash was seized by the security forces. There is no state of emergency in the South St. Catherine Police Division. All of that successful operation took place outside of a state of emergency. So I am convinced, and you have spoken to it, Prime Minister, the kinds of intelligence being applied can give result. Let us move forward with greater trust to deal with the criminals in those areas without at the same time imposing the negative sides that come with a state of emergency. So I put it to you, we are prepared to even look at the regulations hereafter when we would have passed the St. Catherine North to ease some of those strictures that can make life more bearable. And again, in closing, Minister, there are some issues which I said I'm not going to raise them publicly, which need to be dealt with so that when the state of emergency is over, and I'm hoping that this one for St. Catherine, looking forward to be the last. The people in the community, part of it is in my own constituency, so I can relate to it in a direct way. They welcome the reduced level of murders and criminal activity. But you know what they tell me, Prime Minister, their concern is that many of those suspected persons are not being apprehended, and now they are fearful of what will happen when the state of emergency comes to an end. That is part of the reality that they face. So, Mr. Prime Minister, as it said by the leader of the opposition, we support this extension. Much has been gained, but there's still more to be done. Even the numbers you gave, Prime Minister, about the reduction in North, data I'm looking on, year to year, it's a reduction of 5 murders. 70, my numbers from the police, up to Sunday, 770 at that time last year to 65 this year. And in the shootings, it's down by 8 up to the 7-day Sunday numbers. But every reduction is welcome. Even 1% or one less murder or shooting is welcome because it makes for a better life for everybody. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker.
I just need to go ahead.
It can be argued that the upsurge in criminality in the St. Catherine North Division has been real. And certainly, I believe it might have necessitated the state declaration of a state of emergency in the first place. The question I ask today, though, Mr. Speaker, is whether or not this upsurge in criminality could not have been addressed through concentrated policing efforts and enhanced security measures, which could have been implemented without the blanket declaration for the entire geographical area. Mr. Speaker, what we are currently experiencing is the sense that the government is devoid of a comprehensive plan and has resorted to the use of the state of emergency as a crime strategy. Even as the Constitution explicitly imputes that this is not the reason for which one ought to be declared. Mr. Speaker, in my own constituency, what we find is that the state of emergency is acting more as an inconvenience to law-abiding citizens and is having a negative impact on businesses as opposed to acting as a real deterrent to crime. Mr. Speaker, one of the significant economic drivers of my constituency is nightlife and entertainment. Bars. In the upscale communities, they call them clubs. In Brunswick Avenue and Bogwart, they call them bars. Shops, grocery shops, cook shops, corner shop, restaurants, the staging of dances, parties, round robins. In the state of emergency, Mr. Speaker, I beg to argue that the citizens who suffer the most are those who are the poorest among us. Mr. Speaker, all of the activities in the creative industries have been negatively affected. Based on the stipulated early closure for these businesses, the curtailing of the movement of potential customers and patrons, as well as the revocation or lack of issuance of permits for events. This has had a significant negative impact on the economic life of the constituency I represent. Mr. Speaker, scores of these businesses operators in my constituency have indicated to me that based on the downturn in business since the start of the state of emergency, if it were to be continued beyond July 3rd, they will be forced to close their businesses. That is not speculation. It is a fact and a reality in a lot of cases. The livelihood of many of our people is centered around income generation from the creative industries. How will the school fees be paid in September? Mr. Speaker, being that the impact on law-abiding citizens and businesses is so profound. We need to then ask ourselves as to the impact of the state of emergency on criminals and criminality. Mr. Speaker, while we may point to the marked reduction in crime and the figures in the geographical area, we have witnessed a national increase in some communities which we never saw this level of crime before. Where there are zozos, there is the implementation of a social intervention program. Where there is a state of emergency, there is absolutely nothing that will be left behind and no plan in place that will take us beyond the state of emergency. What is to become of St. Catherine following the state of emergency? I certainly, like many others, Mr. Speaker, would like to see the crime abated in our country. I wish for all governments to succeed in the fight against crime, and the aims and intentions must be predicated on wanting a Jamaica free of crime and free of the fear of crime. We need a comprehensive crime plan that allows Jamaicans to feel safe and that can indeed return us to the days when we can, in fact, sleep with our windows and our doors open. We need a plan driven by data and intelligence and remove the need for the knee-jerk response of the improper and unfortunate use of the state of emergency. Mr. Speaker, it is for this reason that we once again call on the Prime Minister and the government to present the country with a reputable plan which will be sustainable and to cease the dependence on states of emergency, which, as is evident, shows as not having the effect in combating crime nationally. Mr. Speaker, fear is one of the most powerful human emotions. While highly useful in situations where a threat of immediate harm exists, it is the most debilitating and dangerous of emotions. I can't help but feel fear is being used as a tool to manipulate our people. I understand the reasoning of the government in its decision to introduce the state of emergency, as the criminal minds among us were determined and are determined to create mayhem and inflict harm on each other, to include the law-abiding citizens of our country. Mr. Speaker, in the absence of a comprehensive plan, I eagerly, though skeptically, supported the measure which would have even given temporary relief to our people of the gruesome murders which were brought so forcefully home to us on social media. When we live in a state of panic, there is no peace. And when there is no peace, there is no faith, thus removing our state of freedom. Fear affects our behavior, our politics, our economics, and our social life. The fear we speak of is not just fear of the criminals and what they produce. There's a real fear that we are just not in control of creating a society devoid of perpetual fear. The fear we speak of emanates from the very presence of the concentrated numbers of security forces seen daily in our communities, removing our sons and our daughters from our streets, reducing our freedoms and reminding us of our fear. The fear we speak about is created from the feeling that the crisis will never go away, and so we will forever live in a police state. The fear is real and is a feeling that will permanently affect the psyche of our people. Who will address the psychological consequences? Mr. Speaker, as government, the people have elected you to find solutions to improve the quality of their lives. I implore you, Prime Minister, don't use the people's fear to promulgate public relations as a facade, as at least we're doing something. Do not use fear, the fear of our people, to remove their rights and freedoms as guaranteed in the Charter of Rights. Let us not use their fear to control their minds to believe that the state of emergency is the only solution to solve crime. Let's provide them with the truth and introduce them to real security measures through a sustained plan to rid ourselves from the scourge of crime across the country. I beg of you, Prime Minister, end this state of emergency and do right by the good people of our country. The strategies now employed can be done without removing the rights of all Jamaicans. Mr. Prime Minister, I will not vote today, as I am not prepared to sell the rights of the people of North Central St. Catherine, who elected me to represent them in this Parliament. Thank you.
Mr. Daly.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Daly.
Mr. Speaker, I did not intend to speak today because I was very reluctant to support this motion for an extension. But Mr. Speaker, I know there's a lot of jokes about the constituency in which I represent. And I've heard a lot of things being said in this House in regards to that particular constituency. I have been in the St. Catherine Parish Council for 26 years. And I've watched all around Spanish Town being deteriorated because of lack of social intervention. Mr. Chairman, when I look around, well, I am not talking about what ears, I know. Mr. Chairman, I listened to the Honorable Prime Minister, and the statistic proved that St. Catherine North, in particular, the constituency in which I represent, have a very high level of crime. However, it was given a state of emergency instead of a zone of operation, special operation. How comes? How comes? If you have a place with that kind of statistic, it would have shown that they need serious intervention. It cannot be a band-aid. It cannot be a suppression. It must be solution. Mr. Speaker, I'm very, very serious because I don't support crime. I've been operating a school and education institution for 33 years. And if you were to go in Spanish Town and its environ, they would tell you I try to empower and to educate and to get persons to be rehabilitated. So therefore, I know I'm not part of the problem. There are a number of us who pretend as if they are not part of the problem. But I know I'm part of the solution. I am saying now, Mr. Speaker, and it is for the very last time that I will be adding my voice in accepting, because the reason why I am doing it, I know perception is sometimes bigger than reality. And they might believe that by not supporting, I am supporting criminal elements. I am supporting justice, and I'm supporting human rights. Mr. Speaker, I reluctantly will be supporting this extension. And I am saying you cannot wait until this is ended. The last one now that I am going to support for social intervention to start. I need to hear, to see, and to be a part of some dialogue that is going to change the life of those who have potential to create crime or for those who are creating the crimes right now into the country. It is not a joke, because it is not about grandstanding, and it is not about making Jamaica feel that you are doing something, when in truth and in fact, we are really and truly putting more fear, because they are wondering when this ends, what will happen to them. Mr. Speaker, the time has come that we need to come together to realize that our youths are at risk. And we need to do something comprehensive, not a 6-week program, not a 3-month program, but a program long enough in order for us to be able to capture those that are very vulnerable and the unattached youths. Mr. Speaker, I am begging of the Prime Minister to sit down now, not just trying to eradicate crime, but to see what kind of measures to be put in place so that we will have our young people be attached to something that is meaningful, productive, and that they can be able to grow this country. Mr. Speaker, I am imploring upon the Prime Minister to stop this little band-aid thing about Zozo, state of emergency, and let us sit down parish by parish if we cannot afford the finances to do them all. But we look at the most vulnerable and look and see how we can start to empower, educate, and eradicate crime in our society. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, Mr. Speaker, I too had not planned to speak this evening. But, you know, sometimes what you can achieve by hook, you have to achieve by crook. By any means necessary. By any means necessary. I apologize for missing the beginning of your presentation, Prime Minister. I was on a panel, in this case representing the Minister of National Security as well as myself, since he missed it, on the Masters in National Security that's being offered at UWI, I think in conjunction with the Ministry of National Security. But fortunately, technology allows PBCJ to stream even on a mobile device. And I was listening to you coming on my way back down here from Mona. And you spoke to the role of the gangs in the weakening of the state. But I wanted to point out that the state is weakened in many ways. For example, corruption is as corrosive in weakening the state as vast amounts are robbed from the treasury, and those same funds are often used to bribe law enforcement, to bribe customs, to bribe public servants, and divert these same limited resources which we need so that we can have saturation policing in more than just St. James, so that we can have social interventions in more than just Mount Salem,
That's right.
and we can have new police cars and other resources available. Organized crime, and you will recall from the National Security Policy, Prime Minister, which I've heard you quote a number of times, so I know you're familiar with it, that they identified organized crime, and in particular, the nexus with corruption, as one of the major threats to our national security.
Only recently, we heard of a public sector employee, an employee of NESL from the Ministry of Science, Technology, and Energy, arrested and charged, along with a co-accused, of a number of offenses, including money laundering. It was reported that 85 million in cash was found. We haven't 85 cash. We haven't heard the full story.
You have a problem with that, sir?
We heard.
I thought you weren't supposed to. Okay.
We heard in media on Friday of cases of fraud being exposed in the Petrojam corporate donations, where agencies, community, groups that were supposed to be the beneficiaries spoke of letters being forged in their name. We know here, as of this evening, that we not only have the Auditor General at Petrojam doing an audit, we have MOCA doing an investigation, and the Integrity Commission now also in there. We should be reminded that this company, Petrojam, has resources equal to some of the largest corporations in Jamaica. This is not a mom and pop shop. This is a huge corporate entity. So when corrupt persons have access to those types of resources, that is how you can get hundreds of guns purchased at one time. That is how you can bribe police officers with vast sums of money. Yep. That is how you can get, that is how you can offer, as in that raid, $20 million to a police officer to look the other way, or to open a container but not see anything. And I think it's important that we understand the nexus between the earlier friction we had here this afternoon in Parliament and the challenges we're facing with organized crime right now. We're focusing on the violent crime that is being directly and frontally addressed by the state of emergency. But let us understand, it is not the declaration of a state of emergency that is seeing the reduction. It is the saturation policing and the saturation military in St. James that is causing the reduction. In fact, the entire reduction year to date is due to the reduction in St. James. We've seen much more modest results in St. Catherine North because the security forces don't have the resources to blanket St. Catherine North in the same way that they have St. James. But more important is, in the long term, is that corruption drains the funds for enforcement, but more so the funds for the social intervention that the lady members from St. Catherine spoke to earlier.
Birth certificate and dental care can't cut it,
The, TRN number and birth certificate is good. It's better than nothing.
Yes, but that is not what we
But the kind of fundamental interventions that we need in infrastructure, in better schools, in garbage collection, in stopping the sewage running in the streets in Kingston and South St. Andrew. That's going to take massive amounts of money. And we certainly don't have enough to be frittering it away with cronyism and corruption. We had we had a workshop this morning. You know, it's ironic, Mr. Speaker. We had a workshop this morning. It was called a refresher workshop. And it was to acquaint maybe some of the newer members and to reacquaint some of us who have been here 4 or 5 or 6 or more terms with the importance, with the fundamentals of the Westminster-style parliamentary democracy system. And it struck me that it spoke to the importance of parliamentary oversight of public expenditure. If you frustrate that parliamentary oversight, you encourage the corrupt.
That's correct.
If you frustrate that parliamentary oversight, you weaken our parliamentary democracy.
Yes.
And Mr. Speaker, not only is parliamentary oversight of the executive a fundamental element of our parliamentary democracy, but a principal tool of this oversight is questions by members.
Yes. Yes.
Question time is on the order paper every single meeting.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And it is because, along with the parliamentary committees which provide oversight, that this is one of the key elements. So, Prime Minister, just as you say, just as you have said in almost all of these debates on extending whether ZOSO or the states of emergency, you have said that it is important for both sides of this House to present a united front to send a message to the criminals. I am going to suggest to you that it is equally important that we send a united, that we present a united front and send a clear message to the corrupt. And every time we attempt to frustrate the constitutional responsibility of the opposition to provide that oversight, every time we do that, we send a message of encouragement to every corrupt public official in this country. So, Prime Minister, at the end of the day, you have the responsibility, you more than any of us in this House, because you command the support of the majority. And therefore, you can ensure that that majority is not used as an instrument of oppression of the voices of the opposition. And I call on you in this debate to make a clear statement this afternoon, this evening, before we have any more casting social media and the trolls come on and everybody tries to put a political spin on it. This is an opportune time for you to send a message about how your side will contribute to this parliament sending a united front when it comes to parliamentary oversight, when it comes to parliamentary committees being chaired by the opposition, when it comes to allowing members' questions to be dealt with promptly and fully and not hide behind the majority and the Speaker to frustrate those efforts. Thank you.
All right. Dr. Chan.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister has indicated clearly what are the reasons to extend the state of emergency
both in North St. Catherine and in St. James. Of course, the debate on St. James will take place at a later date. But I think it is incumbent on me as the Minister of National Security to say a few comments, especially related to some of what has been said here this evening. First of all, I said in North St. Catherine, we can see clear reasons. Homicide is maybe, as I indicated in my earlier presentation in the sectoral debate, is the index by which the community measures crime fight. It's the immediate situation. It creates fear, it disrupts the community, even more, in more ways than the state of emergency. And I want to comment on that. So the immediate situation of the security forces is to reduce homicide and violence. That is not debatable, and therefore action is taken to do that now. Of course, other things are necessary in the medium term. And in North St. Catherine, factually, the homicide rate in the zone that has been established, state of emergency, we're running at about 5 per week, pre-state of emergency. Since then, we're at about 0.8 and going down. That's the number as they spin. Since the state of emergency. So although you're only 5 behind last year, there's been a dramatic fall off. And we need to maintain that. One of the features of the 2 areas which have the state of emergency is that gangs have become institutionalized in these areas. I read in my presentation again last week, an article was written by the newspaper published then by that party in 1972, which referred to the emergence of serious gang activity in Montego Bay. That was 46 years ago. I mentioned that, Mr. Speaker, because in order to achieve some of the objectives that have been alluded to by my friend from St. Catherine, I said we have got that good point in terms of the level of cooperation policy. But the programs we're alluding to, if we're going to dismantle and arrest the gangs, before I get to corruption, we need time. They have become a part of the community in a way that not only are people fearful to speak, they are literally in the community as part of it, the sons and daughters and nephews. Therefore, it will take time, even with satisfactory intelligence and increased investigation, to identify all of the perpetrators. In fact, what you have in the early stages, and we can refer to Montego Bay, when you take out leaders who are known and established, like Ratty and Bowser, there will always be a reduction as well, but it won't last long. You need time to get in and get those who are being recruited. And I've come to social mention. You need times who are involved in the gang, because as soon as the big one goes, the big gangster shut up. Somebody tried to emerge again in due course. Amen. And this is part of the reason why the history of success in Jamaica's fighting crime has been intermittent. So something happened when you're Minister of National Security. Excellent. And I recognize it and commend it, but so you reduce the transshipment of coke and the homicide rate went down. State of emergency 2010, it went up, went down again, but pretty soon it started going up again. And therefore the country, I agree, has to focus on what will we do different to ensure we can sustain this. But while we need to discuss that, there's an immediacy of continuing to control the spaces and find a way to dismantle some of the institutionalized gang in the community. It's an epidemic generated by gangs which are very much a part of the community. And when we think of business activity reduced, it is true, and it's not so much business has reduced, it's a changing pattern of business. So that, and there's also the risk, danger in business which we must speak of. In terms of the timing, you'll find a worker who, and Montego Bay is easier to illustrate, we are a 24-hour town. The worker will now buy their pharmaceuticals or their grocery or anything else at the institution near to the workplace. So somebody, pharmacy in Montego open 24 hours before the state of emergency. Gas station open 24 hours. But you'll find now that they're closing at 11 or 9, depending on the commander's discretion at the time. You'll find that the taxi operator will now buy the gas at the gas station near to where they're picking up the workers, rather than until when they get back to near the home. This is a shift in business. So the farmers that is near to on, that's all that's happening there. So business is still going on. But I'm saying the truth is that many things change the virtue of business. And in the face of the challenge we face with crime and violence, that's a simple shift that should not be used to move back to where we were. In addition to that, in our urban communities, inner city communities, there's also honest individuals there have lost business, I agree. But there are some, we must not forget that in the kind of situation that happens in these areas, where illegal money is coming in through drugs and scamming, a lot of entertainment is used to rinse money. And the drive for social intervention and economic opportunity is absolutely necessary to provide alternative, because much of the activity being alluded that might be disrupted. One has to be careful we're not justifying a system that maintains the same gang we're talking about. And in my own situation, I'm aware that there are some individuals that have adjusted, honest ones. I know you have people renting plastic pools, and they have day parties start 12 o'clock in the end of fry fish instead of night parties with dance or thing, and they make the same amount of money. They'll adjust in the interim, because this will not be permanent. We have made that point, but there's an immediate situation to maintain the pressure on the perpetrators of violence. And that cannot be, that is what we have to unite on. Going forward, of course, we have to initiate activities, and I want to remind this honorable host that social intervention is not something that was just appeared on the horizon newly in this house or in any of the governments. In fact, the first attempt at initiating a comprehensive social intervention program was raised by former Prime Minister Bruce Golding in 2010, when he announced the development of a comprehensive community renewal program in 100 districts which are socially and economically impaired. And the move was to seek to get funding to start a comprehensive social intervention in all those communities. The program died in the various activities that led up to the election. The planning is still there, the Planning Institute of Jamaica. And in fact, some activities have been picked up by the Jamaica Social Investment Fund in several communities. And it's those communities they have been working with. And the Ministry of National Security has further identified 20 volatile and vulnerable communities which we are looking at designing intervention programming even before you get to the kind of special security program. Because the government recognizes that this is necessary, but we cannot await the development of the plan or the budget to intervene in 100 communities or in the 35 communities before we seek to reduce the violence that is creating mayhem and murder. The other comment I would make, I think, I'm sure the member from Central Manchester was here last week, when I made the comment very clearly, corruption, one of the critical points that we will, as a government, that we are concerned about is corruption. It was made very clearly in my presentation, and I'll quote from it again. Mr. Speaker, and I come to correct. Corruption is a foundation for successful organized crime, which drives homicide and institutional failures. Say no more. This government, and with the cooperation of the opposition, have in fact initiated legislation that have created the Independent Integrity Commission. We have completed legislation to make MOCA autonomous. And I've said that. So I think in getting here, no, but we have completed legislation, right? And I mentioned those two indicate that the country is moving towards taking steps to have institutions that can deal with corruption. And that we cannot start, that is not something we should begin to draw a line in between here. We have agreed that. And therefore, it is not a failure that the Integrity Commission, Auditor General, and we have indicated the MOCA have gone down to look at a Petrojam. There have been some allegations swirling around, before we begin to take all kind of action, get the facts. And we have institutions I'm confident can go in there, identify the problems, and deal with the facts and deal with it decisively. And I'm confident the government will so deal with them. The issue dealing with, I'm going to finish, the issue in Old Harbour and the gentleman from Nisal is an individual, and it is the commendation of the Improved Intelligence Service. FID went there and intervened. FID is part of the security apparatus based in the Ministry of Finance. They took CTOG and intervened, identified the criminal. The criminal elements, as I indicate from my own presentation, is in all areas of society. And I may go back to quote from that organized crime depends on a network like any corporation. Includes the organized entrepreneur, criminal entrepreneur, lawyers, doctors, business, etc. And then government, the outer government. It's not my style, but I'll mention one event. Scamming started with a young man in Montego Bay in 1993 who worked in the free zone. We called Bebe, I don't remember right name. Everybody knows he was affiliated with the PNP youth arm. But I have not made an attempt to say scamming is on that side. Right? Bebe, you can't recall. Bebe was an active part of it. I was PNP YO. And I would come here and it has spread all over in scamming, and therefore deal with it. So all I'm saying is, by identifying a gentleman who is a criminal who worked at Nisal, has nothing to do with either Nisal or the ministry. There are other areas of government and business which have individuals who are in organized crime. And I always say to you that with the institutions we have jointly put in place here and give them the autonomy. MOCA will have its final reading in the House in another week or two. We have the amendments from the Senate. They will be fully staffed, and I'm very confident a lot of those organized criminal units, which we will find will be crossing party lines, will be apprehended and dealt with without any bias or at this point. And we need to do so to begin to really lay the foundation for sustainable reduction in crime and violence. And this government is committed to that, and it will become visible as we go forward. We have the institutions, we have the commitment, and the first call of the Ministry of National Security, while social intervention is crucial, and I mentioned it, it's one of the 6 points I mentioned going forward in part of our strategic movement. The first responsibility of the Ministry of National Security is to protect the life and well-being of our citizens. And therefore, we have to continue with the special operations we have in place, with special sections of emergency or ZOSO or operation. We will take action to protect the lives of Jamaican citizens, and we will continue to build out institutions that alluded to that have the capacity to deal with corruption and violence. I'll continue to indicate that other bits of legislation, the Ministry have been charged with amending other bits of legislation into the anti-gang legislation, which will be critical in being able to define, monitor, and apprehend the gangsters, including it will be done. The review, the basic work is being done. I expect in a few weeks it will be available. It will not be done thrown on you overnight, sir. But we are doing it, and I want to reaffirm the commitment and urge we continue to support the zones, the state of emergency in this particular areas they are now existing, because we need that facility to continue to maintain a lid and violence crime. There is no question the homicides in the areas have gone down significantly. In St. James, it's 9 to 1 less than last year. That's fact. Okay? So we need to maintain that process and continue to do the work we're doing to build out institutional framework to ensure sustainability. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I seek your permission to speak from a seat on the memorial. Thank you very much. In truth, I had not made up my mind whether I was going to speak. But I sat there listening And there are some things that weigh heavily on me as a representative, not speaking here on my own behalf, but speaking on behalf of the citizens of Southwest St. Andrew who have voted and given me a mandate to come into this house. So when I stand to speak, I stand on their shoulders. Mr. Speaker, let me just make one comment as it relates to the statements by the Minister of National Security. I think it was on Friday, there was a statement that came out suggesting that the cabinet was in a discussion and that subsequently they were thinking of whether or not MOCA, for example, should be involved in what was happening at Petrojam. I heard this on Friday afternoon. Yes. Yes, and as I think about it, whether it could be that that was not so, and I would be pleased to hear that that was not so, but that was what was actually carried, and that was what came to many of us. And just the thought of the cabinet or the minister determining whether or not MOCA should enter the fray. Yes.
The amendment to the legislation was brought. I had the privilege of having to deal with it in its amended form. And you'll see, it's on the House, but I have seen it was on my personal intervention as minister that Clause 3, Section 9 was deleted, which was in the bill, and there was moved to make it more palatable, that the minister could give direction to the Director General of MOCA. And it was completely taken out, not even alluded to in any halfway. So this minister cannot give direction to MOCA. We set policy, as we are a government, but yes, and that is, you will see in what I'm doing. No, you can look at the amended bill that we'll debate next week on 11th, and you'll see that Clause 3 of Section 9 was deleted completely from the bill, and my instruction and request. Right?
Thank you very much, Minister. And I am relieved, very relieved, to hear the clarification that has been made. And I thank you for that. Mr. Speaker, as I listened to the member from St. Catherine who spoke earlier, and as I listened to her speak about the impact on the community and how difficult it has been, I was reminded of my own sentiments that I expressed in this House several weeks ago, and which is my unease with the state of emergency versus the Zozo. I mean, everybody knows my penchant for social intervention and not just the straight crime-fighting activities. And all of what she said was exactly what was in the back of my mind, that was in my head, when I spoke then about not wanting to see a state of emergency because I wanted the accompanying social intervention. And so I was moved particularly by the statements, the comments that she made. And then I considered, Mr. Speaker, what was happening in St. Andrew South, as I do from time to time, since it is my specific mandate, although I also understand the broader mandate that I have as a member of this House. As I looked at it, I recognized that since January, we have had 78 murders, 24 more in the police division, yes, in St. Andrew South. 24 more murders than last year this time. Yes, the shootings have gone down, so we are at 70, as against 72 last year. Robberies, though, 66, as against 44 last year. That's 22 more. So if we talk about the murders, we talk about the shootings, we talk about the robbery, we get a sense as to the kind of fear that was spoken about earlier in terms of communities like these. And we recognize that it's not tenable. It's not tenable. The children that we raise in these communities are not being given the best chance to be their most productive self or the best version of themselves that they can be with the circumstances, the context under which in which they grow, without the kind of intervention that deals with the schools that they go to, the academic output, the resources that are there, what's happening to a lot of their parents and family members who are on path, yeah, and all of that. And then I had made a note to talk about the 20 communities that the minister referred to, the 20 volatile communities. Mr. Speaker, I cannot be satisfied. I cannot be pleased. I cannot be comfortable to think that communities that I serve could very well have to wait on a division by division approach, I think is what was called earlier. Be quiet and allow me. Be quiet. You be quiet and allow me. I'm not sure of the point being made, but I will remain focused because the point being made does not take away from exactly what I'm saying. And the point being made by the member from West Kingston has me perplexed. It has me perplexed because he's not the only one who makes those kind of comments when we on this side speak. And I'm not sure what the point is that you're making. Because if we identify the problem that exists, and if you agree that it is a problem, and you agree that it requires our combined efforts to deal with it, why do you get annoyed because we say it? If it is a fact, it is a fact. I am not here talking about who is responsible or who is not responsible. Today in 2018, Angela Brown-Burke is the Member of Parliament for Southwest St. Andrew. And when I speak on their behalf. And I do not give two hoots when I'm speaking about who was there before and who did what or who did not do what. No, I'm dissing no one. I do not give two hoots. No, I do not give two hoots. And I am clearing that. Clearing that because I know that I have a mandate. What you should withdraw is your interruption of the member who is on the floor. Have some respect and be quiet. The reason, and many of us need to do that, because often when we begin to talk about what's happening, the first comment that we hear, how long is the PNP there? What did you do? It does not matter. History has us today. History has us today in this position with a responsibility. And Mr. Prime Minister, I'm going to tell you this. When you leave here, I am going to suggest that you have a session with your members and you explain to them what you are trying to achieve in terms of the cooperation, because that kind of attitude does not engender the level of cooperation that you're trying to achieve. I am not here talking about you being responsible for the crime. I'm not saying that. I am saying that it comes to us today as members with a responsibility and faced with a particular context. And we have to face that context and determine what our role is and what we are going to demand on their behalf. There are so many kids that I talk to every single day in Southwest St. Andrew who are burdened by their circumstances, who I know are looking on me to make sure when I come here, I do not forget that darkness provides cover for criminal activities. Therefore, when Waltham Park Road, when Maxfield Avenue, when Spanish Town Road, when all of these roads are in darkness, it affects what's happening there. We should not have to wait on Zozo to get our street lights on the main thoroughfare. We should not have to wait on a Zozo to do that. And so when we come to talk about the state of emergency or Zozo, I want to remind us that Jamaica is not only those areas where the state of emergency or the Zozo is operating. And in fact, if we were really serious about a multi-sector and interdisciplinary approach to fixing crime, we would not have to come here time after time to make these same points. Spanish Town Road, for example, is part of where we have the diversion in terms of traffic, right in that Portia Simpson Miller Square. And can you imagine that where you are diverting traffic to is in darkness? When persons come off the bus on Spanish Town Road and they want to go up into their community, sometimes they tell me that they have to wait on others so that they are not alone. Now, that cannot be acceptable. I'm saying, as we work on the Zozo and the other issues, we also need to remember the other communities and what is happening there. We need to remember, as we take people off path, what that does to their ability to send their children to school. And we have to remember that if they cannot send their children to school today, that next year and the following year, 5 years from now, we are looking at individuals with very low academic levels. And again, creating the circumstances for the same criminal behavior. And therefore, I'm saying we have to begin to see. I want to feel, Mr. Prime Minister, that you're serious about that multi-sector approach, that communities like the one I serve have an opportunity, not in another 5 years, not in another 10 years, but now to begin to see some of these other things addressed. I keep talking about it all the time. Street lights, Maxfield Avenue, Waltham Park Road, Boyens Avenue, Norman Lanes. But, I mean, I could go on and on. I'd love to invite you. You once invited a member from Southwest St. Andrew to walk with you. I want, hand in hand. I want to invite you one night, hand in hand, so you can see the darkness that operates there. I don't need 2 streetlights. I need Spanish Town Road lit. We need Maxfield Avenue lit. We need Hagley Park Road lit. That is what we need. Mr. Speaker, this is not, we need a skills training. This is not a PNP or JLP issue. But I'm going to tell you this. If the other members, the Prime Minister alone cannot carry it. You cannot carry it by yourself. You need the support from your members. And what is obvious in this House is that they don't fully understand the problem as you do. And therefore, I'm going to ask you again before I sit to make sure you put them in a room, you close the door, and you have a conversation with them. Because when they come in here, they believe that it is playtime. When they come in here, they forget that they are representing people and that it is their lives that we are playing with. Thank you.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank members for their contribution. Having regard to the time, I will just give very brief responses to the issues that have been raised. I wish to say to the Leader of the Opposition that the National Security Council, in reviewing the application of the extraordinary powers under the state of emergency, has looked at the issues of how the freedom of movement is applied, and to things such as curfews and closing times. And Mr. Speaker, as you would see that the security forces have progressively loosened the restrictions. So, for example, in St. James, they would have started with a closing time of, I believe, it would have been at 7, and then they've progressively, as the security condition allows, they have progressively loosened that restriction. So, Mr. Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition and other members have raised the issue about the strictures imposed by the curfews and the closing times. And Mr. Speaker, we will again review them to ensure that there is no adverse impact to commerce. There is a major event coming up in Montego Bay, Sumfest, and we are very sensitive again that that is almost a national festival. No, I'm not certain that we will be having a free-for-all. But, Mr. Speaker, there may have to be provisions made. Now, Mr. Speaker, in the other communities in North St. Catherine where there is a state of emergency, the issues that have been raised about the impact on commerce is something that I am sensitive to. And I wouldn't want in any way that the creative industries are affected by the imposition of a state of emergency. If we can find an accommodation, I will take a second look at it, Mr. Speaker. I have no challenge in saying that we are imposing a state of emergency to deprive people of having fun and being able to socialize. So that is something that I am sympathetic towards. Mr. Speaker, the issues raised about street lights and infrastructure and the need for social intervention, and let's put a Zozo in there. Mr. Speaker, I can identify with the member from South West St. Andrew, who is my neighbor, and who was former mayor. And as any good MP would do, would stand up at every single opportunity to represent our constituency. We have no challenge with that on this side. But I wish to point out that, Mr. Speaker, yes, we exist at a point in time, but our being is really a connection of points in time. The point I want to make is that you may very well be at that side now, and you say that it is now my road. But you know, the truth is that the seat that you now occupy, not physically or literally, but figuratively, the seat that you now occupy was occupied by someone who occupied it for close to 40 years. And held many positions, including that of Prime Minister. So the point that we should, Mr. Speaker, let me fill you with my attention.
Order, please. Order.
The point, and I don't want the point to escape the membership of the House, because, Mr. Speaker, look, it's not my intention to devolve the debate, but there must be a point of understanding, Mr. Speaker, that the Leader of the Opposition stands up and says there must be continuity. In a sense, he's saying that we are all connected to what we have done in the past as we project to do in the future. We can't escape that at some point in time, whether it is a future point or a past point, we were responsible. So, Mr. Speaker, I am now responsible, and I can't in any way shirk that responsibility. And I am doing, Mr. Speaker, when I stand here, I am standing here confident that I am giving my 110% to the people of Jamaica. I stand here, Mr. Speaker, because I take it personally that if by the actions of my leadership and the government that I lead and the people in the government and even the opposition, that by just our action we are able to save one life. If we reduce the murder rate by 5 or 76, Mr. Speaker, we have made it better. So when people were dying, and I recall the member from, remind me of your constituency, St. Catherine Eastern, stood up and raised concern about the murders in our constituency. And other persons on that side raised concerns. We developed a program and we acted. We acted. And we are now seeing that there are some results. You know, Mr. Speaker, in my presentation, I haven't given the statistic about the reduction in murders generally, because the member from Manchester Central suggests that, well, the entirety of the reduction is just St. James. Mr. Speaker, the strategy is bigger than states of emergency and zones of special operations. Mr. Speaker, if there is any objective assessment of the success of the strategy, it must be that people feel safer in their community. And I would challenge the opposition to, on their own, go and conduct a survey and find out whether or not people actually feel safer in those communities. That's all we need. Now, Mr. Speaker, the member from Central Manchester made a profound point. He said it is not only gangs that challenges the authority of the state, that corruption is just as corrosive, weakening the state, just as corrosive. And he is inviting me to join him on a campaign against corruption. Mr. Speaker, we on this side have been on that campaign before you have discovered it. And Mr. Speaker, I will give him credit that is due, because I will jog his mind a little bit. In 2009, when the first integrity bill was being debated, I don't know how many of you in this house remember that. That it was not a unified position. Precisely. But it wasn't the case on that side that it was a fully united, nor on this side. So the point I'm saying to you, member, is that Bruce Golding was here and I was there. Peter Phillips was there, and I believe you were beside him. And it was as if, no man, it was the case. The point that I'm making is that we agree there has to be a united front, but you should never present a position as if to say that the government does not take a leadership role in fighting corruption. Let us be clear. The process, well, then you should make the point clearly, because the truth is that we on this side concluded the work which was started in 2009, did make it, had to be resurrected, went through your term, rebuilt. Yes, and you have to get some credit for that. You spent a lot of time to rebuild it, and came and we supported it. And we have now passed the bill, funded the organization. And by the way, it is an independent commission, in the truest sense. That I have been very careful not to say I am going to try to direct an independent commission to go and do an investigation. But it is worth noting, Mr. Speaker, that in the present matter of Petrojan, that the commission has acted. It has acted. A part of the campaign against corruption is not so much to be talking about it, but governments must genuinely not stand in the way of the independent authorities to investigate and find it. Mr. Speaker, the Auditor General is investigating. Precisely. MOCA, another piece of legislation, Mr. Speaker, which we have passed in this House. And MOCA, independent, there is no influence being exercised on them by the government, is investigating. And you know what, Mr. Speaker? In the age that we exist, where, Mr. Speaker, I hear the sort of remarks of the member, and I have to be clear. I didn't take credit. I didn't take credit for MOCA, and I'm not in the House to score points about these things. I've said, Mr. Speaker, that we passed the bill in this House. So, Mr. Speaker, in the time in which we exist, where we have information, easy access, where propaganda is not a new thing. Today we call it fake news. Today we call them alternative facts. But it's the same propaganda. And Mr. Speaker, there are some persons who went to some other countries to train in propaganda. Mr. Speaker, there are people who are masters of it. And the only way, Mr. Speaker, the only way that we can address much of what is in the public domain is if the government submits itself to the various independent investigative authorities and let the chips fall where they may. So, Mr. Speaker, no, because he raised the issue. Mr. Speaker, having regard to the time, I now submit to the House the request that the continuance, the extension of the state of emergency in North St. Catherine be approved.
We will vote by the clerk calling your name. To those in favor and those opposed.
Mr. R. Scott. Mr.
Listen
Azan.
to your name, please.
Mr. Bartlett. Mr. Bartlett.
Who's that?
Dr. Bloomfield. Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown. Dr. Brownberg. Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Bunting. Dr. Campbell. Mr. Campbell. Mr. Leslie Campbell. Dr. Chan. Mr. Chuck. Mr. Clark. I will do. Dr. Clark. Dr. Clark. Mrs. Cuthbert Flynn. Ms. Daly. Ms. Daly. Ms. Daly. What is her vote?
Ms. Daly, we don't hear your vote, please. Ms. Daly, aye.
Thank you. Mr. Daly. Why don't I stop talking so I can listen? Mrs. Dalrymple Phillips. Mrs. Dalrymple Philibert, Dr. Dunn, Mr. Fagan, Dr. Ferguson, Dr. Ferguson, Mr. Goulding, Mr. Goulding, Ms. Grange, Mr. Green, Dr. Guy, Ms. Hannah, Mr. Hales, Mr. Henry, Mr. Holness, Mrs. Holness, Mr. Hutchinson, absent. Mr. Hilton. Mr. Hilton not here. Mr. Jackson. Mr. Kellier. Mrs. Mallow-Huford.
Aye.
Mr. Main. Mr. Mackenzie. Dr. McNeil. Mr. Montague. Ms. Nito. Mr. Michael Phillips. Dr. Phillips. Mr. Pickersgill. Mr. Pickersgill. Mr. Redmond. Mr. Robertson. Mr. Robinson. Mrs. Robinson. Mr. Samuda. Mr. Shaw. Mr. Spencer. Mr. Stewart. Mr. Terrelong. Reverend Thwaites. Voice going on. Reverend Thwaites. Mr. Tufton. Dr. Tufton. Mr. Vaz. Mr. Dwayne Vaz. Mr. Warmington. Dr. Wheatley. Mrs. Williams. Mr. Whittle. Mr. Wright. Mr. Wright. Mr. Paulwell. Mr. Speaker,
The results are as follows. 46 yes, 1 declines to vote, and 16 absent. The vote is in the positive. "46 yes, 16 no. It needs 42, right? You're right. 46 yes, 1 declined to vote, 16 absent.
Mr. Speaker, I ask that you.
Mr. Semudo.
I ask for suspension to allow us to recommit questions and answers to questions. As I indicated earlier, the Prime Minister would be answering 2 questions today. But, you know, Mr. Speaker, if you would permit me, when he shall have answered those 2 questions, and the Minister of Transport has undertaken to answer the 3 questions from the member from Northwest Manchester, there will be only 1 remaining question, and that is the question from the member who rose today and created quite an excitement, and that's a member from Central Manchester. I cannot recall when at this stage, as of tomorrow, we will be down to 1 outstanding question. That is what was referenced here today as a signal of poor surveillance on the rights of the people. 1 outstanding question. So, Mr. Speaker, I ask that the Prime Minister now be permitted to take. No, that was already approved. That was already approved. Prime Minister.
No, the members.
Your questions that he's
Mr. Golden.
Mr. Speaker, I'd ask the Prime Minister if he has answers to my questions at item 8 of the number 8 of the question notice paper.
Prime Minister.
Question number 1. The National Water Commission raised debt financing. Has the National Water Commission raised debt financing by using debt securities in 2018? Or is the NWC in the process of raising debt financing? Answer. The NWC has raised debt financing by issuing debt securities in 2018. The debt securities were issued on April 13, 2018. Question 2. Is the answer, if the answer to question 1 is yes, what is the amount raised and or being sought by the NWC in that debt financing? Response. The NWC, through its 2028, 2038, and 2058 bond issue, sought to raise 15 billion Jamaica dollars from the local capital market. The securities are in 3 tranches. Tranche A for 8 billion Jamaican dollars, Tranche B for 2 billion Jamaican dollars, and Tranche C for 5 billion, with maturities of 10 years, 20 years, and 40 years, respectively. Question 3. How much of that total amount has been raised so far by the NWC? Response: of the total amount offered, which was $15 billion, 12.51 billion was dispersed, with an additional 2.49 billion to be dispersed 12 months after the initial disbursement, provided that the NWC meets certain performance targets related to the installation of 450,000 deal high-performance meters under the smart metering project and a reduction in water leakages under the Kingston and St. Andrew non-revenue water program. So a part of the disbursement is incentivized on performance. Question 4. Which entity or entities were engaged to arrange and or underwrite debt financing? Response: the entity that was engaged to arrange this debt financing was NCB Capital Markets Limited. Question 5. By what process was the entity selected by the NWC to arrange and or underwrite this debt financing? Response: a tender was sent out, a limited tender was sent out to 4 financial institutions to act as arranger for this debt security. These were the Bank of Nova Scotia, Jamaica Limited, and effectively through their agents, Scotia Investment Jamaica, First Caribbean International Bank, NCB Capital Markets Limited, and First Global Bank. Only 2 of the above listed financial institutions responded, the 2 being Scotia Investment Jamaica and NCB Capital Markets. On completion of the evaluation, NCB Capital Markets was selected. Question 6. Which entity was the largest subscriber for these debt securities issued by the NWC, and how many other investors, if any, have subscribed for these securities? Response: NCB Capital Market participated for the entire amount of the $12.51 billion of the 2028, 2038, and 2058 bond offer. The following amounts were thereafter sold by NCB Capital Markets to the following entities. $5 billion of the 2058 bonds were sold to NCB Insurance Company Limited. $500 million of the 2028 bonds was sold to NCB Capital Markets Managed Units Trust. And $300 million of the 2028 bonds were sold to Advantage General Insurance Company Limited. Of course, there may be other onward sales since the preparation of this response. Question 7. Does the Minister consider the relationship between the respective chairman of the NWC and the entity engaged to arrange and or underwrite this debt financing, including their respective roles on the Economic Growth Council, present an apparent conflict of interest in this transaction? If the answer is no, why does the Minister not think so? Response: the simple answer is no. There would be no conflict of interest between the chairman of the NWC and the executive director of the Economic Growth Council. Why? Why simple as well, if you follow the timeline of the transactions. A limited tender was issued on the 6th of March 2017. That is, we had a request for offer for the issuance of the bonds 2017-2018. As I said before, Scotia Investment Jamaica, First Global Bank Limited, First Caribbean International Bank, and NCB Capital Markets responded. Well, were invited to tender. We received 2 responses from NCB Capital Market and Scotia Investment Jamaica. Scotia Investment Jamaica Limited required a government guarantee, and NCB Capital Markets did not. A government guarantee would have been an issue for the reasons provided, which I will provide later on in question 12, in my response to question 12. The person in question, being the chairman of NWC, was not at that time involved with the Economic Growth Council. So the member became a member of the person which we assume that there is a conflict of interest with, Mr. Aubin Hill, became a member of the Economic Growth Council long after the RFP was issued and closed. The RFP was issued on the 6th of March 2017, and it closed on the 10th of March 2017. And this was way before Mr. Aubin Hill became involved with the EGC. In fact, Mr. Hill became involved with the EGC as an employee in October 2017. So there could be no conflict of interest. The transaction was closed and the decision was made long before Mr. Hill became involved with the EGC. Question 8. What is the actual maturity date for each tranche of these debt securities issued by the NWC? Response. The response will be covered in question 9. So let me just shift quickly to question 9. What is the interest rate payable on each tranche of these debt securities issued by NWC? So I'll answer question 8 and 9 together in a table that I have provided. Tranche A is for 8 billion Jamaican dollars. The tenor is 10 years, so the maturity would be 2028, and the coupon rate is 10.5%, gross coupon rate. Tranche B is 2 billion Jamaican dollars. The tenure is 20 years. The maturity would be 2038 rather, and the coupon rate is 11.4%. Tranche C, 5 billion Jamaican dollars, 40 years tenure. The maturity would be 2058, and the coupon would be 13.35%. So that answers both questions 8 and 9. Question 10. Is the minister aware that A, the government of Jamaica is this week auctioning, and I suspect this week meaning the time when the question was tabled, is auctioning a Jamaican dollar bond maturing 2029 with an interest rate of 5.675% per annum. And B, the current weighted average yield on 6 months GOJ Treasury bill is 2.98% per annum. And the simple response is, yes, I am aware of that. And in fact, would expect this because the GOJ's medium-term debt strategy would have pointed to the reduction in interest rates. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, this is something to be celebrated. that we have managed to bring down interest rates to this point. It is a signal of the health of our economic policy and the health of our economy. At the initial stage of negotiations between NCB Capital Markets and the NWC, the trading levels of GOJ securities with similar tenors to the three tranches of bonds that were issued ranged from 10.5% to 13.5%. Interest rates have declined since, hence the low interest rates being offered now for GOJ instruments. Additionally, due to the weak financial position of the NWC, and this is something that eventually we will have to discuss in this House, the financial health of the NWC, NCB Capital Market included a risk premium, which resulted in higher interest rates. The initial negotiation of terms began in the third quarter of financial year 2017-2018, and the legal documentation was signed in April 2018. Question 11. Is the Minister aware that if the NWC issued $15 billion of debt securities, for each 1% per annum reduction of the interest rate, the NWC would save $150 million in interest expense per year while that principal was outstanding? Mr. Speaker, it is not a part of the standing orders for the member to ask a hypothetical question, a speculative question. But, Mr. Speaker, it is an interesting question posed, and so I'm not going to invoke the standing order on this question. So let me provide some context. The loans, well, the reason why the NWC decided to take on these Jamaican dollar loans is that we are exposed to exchange rate fluctuations. Significant exposure. Far more exposure than we are talking about in this hypothetical question of 150 million Jamaican dollars for every 1% per annum reduction. So, for example, Mr. Speaker, the NWC has US denominated loans for 7%. There is a loan there for 71.8 million US dollars. Well, they no longer have it because the transaction would have taken out those loans. But at the time, the interest rate on that loan, Mr. Speaker, was 7.2%. There was another loan there for 14.6 million US dollars. The interest rate on that, Mr. Speaker, was 9.77%. There's another loan for 115 million US dollars. 7%. So, Mr. Speaker, the NWC's balance sheet would be significantly exposed to foreign exchange loss. And by the way, these loans and the interest rates that are on them are very high. In fact, these interest rates have built into them a risk premium by virtue of the very balance sheet of the NWC, not being strong enough to support lenders giving lower rates. So, just to make the point that NCB asking for a risk premium is not different from BNP Paribas asking for a risk premium either. Mr. Speaker, one of the main factors that pushed the NWC to go to the market for these long-term bonds. And by the way, for a local bank to take a 40-year instrument signals that there is a returning confidence in the business sector, that they will hold such a long position. So, Mr. Speaker, one of the main factors that pushed us to go to the market for these long-term bonds up to 40 years is the amount of foreign exchange losses every single year from these foreign exchange loans that this administration inherited in 2016. Mr. Speaker, the foreign exchange losses at the NWC in 2013 was $2.1 billion. In 2014, it was $2.4 billion and $1.3 billion in 2015, plus another $1.9 billion in 2016. These are losses by virtue of the depreciation of the Jamaican dollar, because we have to pay back increased amounts in Jamaican dollars to pay the U.S. interest denominated. In those 4 years, Mr. Speaker, the total loss incurred by the NWC due to foreign exchange loss, without producing one additional drop of water for the people of Jamaica, was $7.76 billion. That's what we lost as a result of having these loans and maintaining them in foreign exchange. Mr. Speaker, we were able to get this amazing $15 billion bond with a portion of it up to 40 years without any government guarantee. And let me say that again, Mr. Speaker, without any government guarantee. Much is made of the point that, the NWC is a government agency, there's an implicit guarantee. But Mr. Speaker, it is not that the banks didn't ask for it. Scotia Investment Jamaica insisted upon it. And we said, no, our economic policy, our commitment to fiscal prudence, and all the other plans that we have can sustain. But that is it. And remember, not to digress, but there is a premium gain from having good fiscal policy. That is the implicit guarantee. Good fiscal policy gives every single government agency, every single public body, an implicit guarantee. And so, Mr. Speaker, the NWC was able to secure this loan without a government guarantee, in spite of its weak balance sheet. Although, Mr. Speaker, I must note that in the last 2 years, the balance sheet of the NWC has shown significant improvement. The $15 billion loan was negotiated in Jamaican dollars, therefore resulting in a reduction in the foreign currency exposure risk to the National Water Commission. But more than that, Mr. Speaker, the NWC will realize net present value savings from lower debt service payments. So, Mr. Speaker, though we talk about the hypothetical loss of $150 million because of a 1% decline, hypothetically, in interest rates, the truth is, Mr. Speaker, that we are saving the country billions of dollars every year by this move. And that, Mr. Speaker, is not hypothetical. That is the fact. Question 12. Given the difference between the interest rate on these NWC debt securities and the current yields on Government of Jamaica debt securities in the market, why did the government not guarantee these debt securities so that the NWC and the Jamaican taxpayers, who through annual financial support provided to the NWC, the GOJ's fiscal accounts ultimately bear the losses sustained by the NWC and could benefit from the immense savings that would result from the substantially lower interest rates that are currently available on the GOJ instrument. Well, Mr. Speaker, my answer to question 11 obviously answers this, but there are other points to note. The GOJ is guided by the legislated ceilings established by the Public Debt Management Act, which limits the government-guaranteed loans to 5% of GDP and 3% of GDP, respectively, for financial year end 2021 to 2022 and 2026 to 2027, respectively. In order to achieve the legislative targets throughout successive financial years, the government has maintained the policy position not to issue any new guarantees. Notwithstanding, the GOJ prudently at times approves extensions of guarantees and therefore did so in March 2018 upon recognition that the National Water Commission's current financial and cash flow position would not allow it to be able to accommodate the repayment of an existing syndicated loan held with BNS, NCB, and First Caribbean International Bank. And that loan is in the amount of $82.4 million, which falls due in December 2018. So, Mr. Speaker, to answer the question, the NWC still has some foreign exchange loans. So it has taken out most, but there's one loan remaining here of $82.4 million. And the government of Jamaica, though we have a strict policy in keeping with reducing our debt to GDP ratio of not giving out willy-nilly guarantees, we do acknowledge that there are some cases where exceptions have to be made, and this is one of them where we have made an exception to extend the existing guarantee that was given for this US dollar loan. But this makes the point, Mr. Speaker, that we must take advantage of the fiscal environment and move out of US dollar loans and into Jamaican dollar loans. Question number 13. Has the NWC received any other offers of debt financing from entities which were not invited to submit bids to arrange or underwrite the NWC's issuance of debt securities? And if so, which entities made those offers and what was the terms? Answer: the NWC received no other offer from any other institution to arrange or underwrite the NWC issuance of debt securities. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Gooley.
Mr. Speaker, I have a few follow-up questions. I want to thank the Prime Minister for his answers and for the information provided. Mr. Speaker, the first question I have relates to the choice of entities that were invited to tender for this financing. In particular, given that what was being sought was some long-term financing, ultimately some 40 years, a third of it is 40-year financing, the rest of it is 20 years and some 10 years. Why wasn't the type of institution that is a repository of long-term funding in J dollars in the country, for example, Sagicor, not invited to tender in this bond issue? The banking sector doesn't typically make large, long-term unsecured loans, and if they do, they will be priced accordingly. Why was this limited tender limited to institutions that are not typically providers of long-term funding, and why did it exclude entities such as Sagicor or pension funds or Guardian Life, for example, that would be the appropriate source of funding such as this? That's the first question I have to ask. The second question I have to ask relates to the point that was made about the US dollar loans. And I, for one, have no objection and support the strategy of refinancing the US dollar loans that the NWC had with J dollar financing. That is clearly a prudent thing to do, and I am pleased that they were able to do it, albeit the timing of it and the resulting conversion of those J dollar borrowings to US to pay off those US dollar loans appears to have had a significant impact on the foreign exchange market. And we have seen a fairly sizable depreciation of the Jamaican dollar over the last 4 to 5 weeks, from down in the 125, 126 range to last week Friday over 132 to 1. And the pressure on the market that was placed by this and some other transactions, but this one in particular, had a significant role in moving the market, at least so it is believed by players in the market. But having said that, the strategy of changing the balance, reconfiguring the currency exposure on the balance sheet of NWC is accepted. But I wanted to ask you, were the loans that were paid out, the US dollar loans to BNP Paribas, Vinci and the syndicate, the 2011 syndicate, were those loans guaranteed by the government of Jamaica? And if they were, then why wasn't that guarantee umbrella used to support borrowing at better J dollar rates than we got from NCB here? Because when you look at these rates, NWC has 40-year money, 5 billion of it at 13.35%, and 2 billion 20-year money at 11.4%. When the government of Jamaica's bonds of those types of tenors are trading and yielding rates that are 5, 6 to 7% lower. And for each 1% of that, there's $150 million a year savings. So if you're talking about 5 or 6 or 7% savings, you're talking about between $600 to $800 billion a year of savings that would have been derived from having those securities issued at rates that are more closely aligned to what the government of Jamaica borrows at. And these are going to be on the books for 40 years. So if you look at the impact on the cash position over time of the NWC from borrowing at these very high rates, you can see that a lot of unnecessary expense, in my view, is being incurred. Because it's not like how the suggestion is that guaranteed debt should have replaced unguaranteed debt. NWC was already occupying part of the guarantee envelope available and so this would have been replacing one block of guarantee debt with another, and would have had the benefit of significantly lower interest rates had that been done. And I wish to point out, of course, that this debt remains part of the public debt stock of Jamaica because it's a specified public body. So it is part of the calculation of our public debt in any event. So I'm wondering why, again, the answer that's provided in relation to why the guarantee wasn't given is not, to my mind, persuasive at all, because the costs to NWC and ultimately to the Jamaican taxpayer will be enormous over the years to come. And those are the two main questions I have, three main questions. Why was the list of persons invited to tender, why did it exclude large players that have long-term savings, pension funds, life insurance companies that would have been able to compete more effectively to provide better price money to NWC? Secondly, were the loans that were refinanced in US dollar loans, were they guaranteed by the government? Apparently they were. And so, really, to my mind, takes a rug out of the argument that this was some strategy to avoid guaranteeing debt. And thirdly, does the Prime Minister not accept that, yes, FX losses have been saved, which is I readily acknowledge and readily support, but the cost of doing so could have been so much lower over the life of these bonds had the credit enhancement been provided by the government in the form of a guarantee, so that the rates at which the funds were borrowed would have been closer to what the government of Jamaica is paying on loans of that tenure, on debt of that tenure. So those are my questions. I believe my colleague may have some, but those are mine.
Prime Minister, I know you made a...
Mr. Bonchin.
Yeah, may I speak from a seat other than my
You
own?
have not... You wish to speak?
I wish to speak from a seat other than my own.
Let's get up and speak. Get up and ask, please, permission to speak. Go ahead.
Yeah. Prime Minister, I have a number of concerns. One of them... Look here now, man. You'll get demoted one time already. Mine you gone next down, right? Prime Minister, based on your answers, and it's not one, the information comes from the answers to two different questions. You said the tender closed in March 17, but the legal close of the transaction was in April 2018. That's correct? Two different questions, but I'm putting them together. The tender close was March 2017. The legal close was April 2018. There's a 13-month gap between putting out a selective tender, making a decision, continuing to negotiate, all the while interest rates falling because our fiscal position has improved. Don't you think, Prime Minister, this is really very poor administration of a tender, of a financial tender? A 13-month elapsed period. When the original bidders, had they been allowed to come back in March this year, may have come back with tremendously more attractive terms. So I really would like you to explain, Prime Minister, why 13 months between getting your price tenders and closing legally when, so many things had changed in our volatile, the world, but particularly in Jamaica, in our volatile financial markets. That gap seems quite extraordinary and has probably cost the country a lot. How can you explain? I'd ask you to explain that long lapse. The second point, you made much of the guarantee or not needing a guarantee. The fact is, Prime Minister, as a former chairman of the Water Commission, I know that no government could walk away from a water commission and allow it to collapse. No government could do that. It would be a public health catastrophe. So every lender to the Water Commission knows whether they have, and certainly NCB would know it, that whether they have an explicit guarantee or not, they have a rock-solid guarantee, because we'll be exposing the country to cholera, diphtheria, any waterborne disease if you didn't have a functioning sole water and sewerage utility. So, certainly any local player will know that whether you have an explicit guarantee or not, you have a government guarantee for your sole water utility. Given that that is the case, how do you explain paying at a minimum on the 10-year tranche a 5% premium, 400 million per year in additional interest to waive this guarantee, just on the short tranche, just on the 2028 tranche, just on the short tranche, 5% times 8 billion on the 2028 tranche is 8 billion. Just on that tranche alone, 400 million per year times 10. 4 billion on just the short tranche is the premium you're paying to say we don't give a guarantee, an explicit guarantee. It's going to be much more on the longer tranches. So overall, we'll probably spend 10 billion additional in debt servicing to not give this guarantee. And you're doing it at a time when... No. No, we're not talking exchange rate. I am comparing your Jamaican dollar guaranteed debt versus your unguaranteed debt. This is not dealing with exchange rate. I'm just talking about guaranteed versus unguaranteed. And we have the example. So this is not talking about an exchange rate. And I'm not arguing for the exchange rate. Although I would. Right. More if you had guaranteed the local currency.
We don't get any benefit from not guaranteed because the debt limits are fixed anyway.
And this was part of the guaranteed debt limit. So really, Prime Minister, I am concerned with the whole management of this transaction. I will accept that it may have been well-intentioned, but I think due to the passage of time, due to, I think, an overvaluation of this explicit government guarantee, when there is a de facto guarantee. And the final point, which I must tell you, I want you to reconsider. You said the timing, the apparent conflict of interest of the chief executive of the Economic Growth Council versus the chairman of the Economic Growth Council was disposed of. Well, the executive director of the Economic Growth Council is the chairman of National Water Commission. The chairman of the Economic Growth Council is also the chairman and principal ultimate shareholder of NCB. So it's a transaction between NCB and the National Water Commission. But in one sphere, the chairman of the National Water Commission is employed to the Economic Growth Council, which is chaired by the chairman and owner of NCB. No. Wait, no, and I'm coming, and I'm saying, although at the time of the tender, well, you said you were negotiating right through until April 2018. So until the documents were signed, you have no deal. Until the legal documents are signed, and I can tell you, we've been there many times, until the legal documents are signed, you have no deal. So during that critical period, for some months during that 13-month period, the chairman of the National Water Commission was in a conflict of interest situation, not an apparent, a clear conflict. I really think you're
It's a wholly owned subsidiary.
Who is the ultimate controlling shareholder of NCB Capital Market? Well, he's the ultimate beneficiary as the ultimate controlling shareholder. Whether there are two layers between him or not, I mean, this is public knowledge. I'm not, this is available in the capital market, in the statements of the Jamaica Stock Exchange. So I'm saying, given, Prime Minister, let me take it. I don't want to particularly target individuals, but no, you chose to bring it at this time. We would have happily done it tomorrow. Yeah. But I'm sure there was a reason why you waited until 10 o'clock. I'm sure there was a reason. Not much media around at this point in time. Absolutely. So let's press along. But I really find it difficult to accept that there was not a conflict of interest. I understand the need to get away from the foreign exchange exposure, but it's difficult for me to accept that not giving a government guarantee warranted such a high premium over that you're going to pay on the interest rate, almost twice the interest rate on the 10-year issue. And third, that whether or not you have an explicit guarantee, you have a de facto rock-solid guarantee from the government for this debt.
Thank you.
I'm not as learned as in matters of finance as the first two speakers are. But, Mr. Speaker, pull this up. Thank you. Yeah, Mr. Speaker. I've had some time dealing with the NWC. And I am convinced that one thing that sections of the society are in is to privatize the Water Commission. I'm glad that the management of the Water Commission is here. And he will tell you that one of the yardsticks you use to judge a supply of water is what is called the NRW, non-revenue water. Was that ever mentioned to you, Mr. PM? One of the biggest program that the NWC now has is the non-revenue water. It's a big contract, and it is going on successfully. And the point is, Mr. Prime Minister, that if they achieve even half of what they intend to achieve, it could deal with all of those loans. It sounds stupendous. Please have yourself educated about NRW and what the possibilities are. And really, I'm really surprised that that has not come up at all. Because it is established, in fact, it was just finished in the Bahamas, as you know. And I think it's the same company that's doing it out here, and they're doing very, very well. So then, I'm a little uncomfortable about this venture. And I have no reason to believe that before the NRW program is finished, that it will change the complexion of the Water Commission in terms of its finances, and it will change it drastically. And as I said, there are those who are dead set and wanting to privatize the NWC. So I wish you could answer.
Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me try and answer the questions that were raised by the member from South St. Andrew. Member sought to find out why is it that institutions like pension funds and the non-bank sector, life insurance companies, and so were not invited. The member in his previous life was a principal of a very large and significant financial house in Jamaica, a dealer in such services. And Mr. Speaker, I don't know if the member is trying to say that the NWC was selective and tried to in any way shut out any other bank. I mean, if that is the question, I can definitively say that the answer is no. If the answer, but the answer to that is simple, that in these large transactions, you look for an arranger. So the arranger would have the capacity to coordinate and mobilize the resources. And then, as I had said in my answer, that NCB took the entire 12.51 and then unsell it. But we don't quarrel about that. We don't quarrel. No, Mr. Speaker, the answer is, Mr. Speaker, the companies, we're coming to that. Mr. Speaker, what the NWC did, they assessed the market for debt that would have an appetite for the debt they plan to issue. And the companies that participated, that were invited, Mr. Speaker, were companies that already held NWC debt. So you would recall in my earlier answer, I explained that the NWC currently has a loan, a syndicated loan of where the balance is now at $82 million US. That syndication was of BNS, NCB, and First Caribbean. So those three companies already understood the debt profile and the risk exposure of the NWC and would probably be the most responsive. Mr. Speaker, the member from Central Manchester asked the question that, you can't fathom why there would be a risk premium and why we would go without offering a government guarantee when implicitly there is already a guarantee. Mr. Speaker, the truth is that Scotia Investment Jamaica said that they would not do the transaction without a guarantee. So from a market perspective, the players in the market are not looking at it from your perspective, from the political perspective. Obviously, the risk profile and the risk appetite met with NCB, but did not meet with other players in the market. And I think that has to be accepted, that once we do have a market situation, we can't impose upon the market what our thinking is. I think that has to be clear. So it's not quite a true statement to say that the guarantee, having the guarantee, would mean that you would get a lower rate. The other point to note, with a member from Central Manchester, is that even though the rates that are prevailing in the market, maybe 5% or whatever they are now, the truth is that there is still a consideration of the current state of the NWC's balance sheet that would not necessarily mean that they would get the lowest rate available in the market. So I don't think you can, again, speculatively say that we have lost a premium of 5%. The truth is that there is a consideration of the risk of the balance sheet. And I don't think it is fair for you, member, to be saying that NWC would have got the lowest rate in the market. That's not quite the case. Coming to the 13-month gap. Mr. Speaker, the 13-month gap is something that we looked at it as well. and there is no question in our minds that that is an extraordinarily long period. But I think the member should also recognize that the NWC would have had to go through a significant process of approval, including from the OUR, to get approval to use the K factor to repay that the stream of bond payments, and that took some time. So you couldn't use this transaction and compare it to other transactions, because there are certain compliance and regulatory requirements that the NWC has, which other agencies probably would not have. That came after the tender. Yeah. Now, the other issue raised by the former minister in charge of water, the non-revenue water is a very important part of policy, and it continues. And to assure you, member, that a part of this loan is structured in such a way that the loan is 15 billion, but they have only dispersed 12.51 billion up front. The rest will only come if we perform on two things. One is we make significant progress in changing out to smart meters, 450,000 meters, and we make the savings based on the non-revenue water project. So it is all tied in. It is all tied in. Let me assure you, member, many persons seem to be of the impression that government policy is to sell the NWC to a private company. And that is the interpretation of divestment. But the NWC is an incredible asset, and what we are trying to do is to get it in shape, to make it financially sound and viable. The owners, it is always a challenge, but it can be done, because as your own member said, the NWC has revenue streams that can be turned into great assets. So, remember, the idea behind the policy of divestment is how to get Jamaicans to own it, and eventually, possibly, to place it on the stock market. That way, it is still under a regulatory umbrella to ensure that the NWC operates in the public's interest. But the question is, the ownership can be dispersed right across the Jamaican society, so that you can own some shares in it, I can own some shares in it, and the person selling in Coronation Market or the bank teller can own some shares in it. And in fact, Mr. Speaker, you know, in the present form, you have to ask yourself, what impact does voters have over the decisions of the NWC? Technically, very little. In the model we are proposing, shareholders will have a significant say over the operations of the NWC. So it would be a far more efficient organization, a more responsive organization, but there would still be a very strong regulatory environment. And Mr. Speaker, we are a far way off from that. We are far way off from that, because as in its present form, that can't be done. But we are working towards making the NWC a profitable organization, which is why we have taken the decision to remove or reduce significantly the foreign exchange losses. So, Mr. Speaker, I'm not saying that this is a perfect transaction, but in this transaction, the Jamaican people have won.
Mr. Speaker, the member from Manchester has done some fancy math without revealing his assumptions. What? No?
Good.
Secretary. Just one question I did. You want us to do the other question? Tomorrow. You want to do the other question tomorrow?
Order, please. Mr. Semuda.
Mr. Speaker, could the Prime Minister answer the questions tabling my name at number 7?
Prime Minister.
Yeah, I'm sending them around. Question. What are the requirements of the position of the Director of the Constituency Development Fund Management Program Unit? The qualifications are postgraduate degree in social sciences or an undergraduate degree in social sciences, humanities, and at least 5 years working experience at the managerial level in the field of project development and writing of project proposals, documents, and strategic plans. Skills in the use of Microsoft Project would be an advantage. Demonstrated skills in applying participatory research and methodologies and social assessment and other required competencies are also included. 2. Was the vacancy advertised as required by Section 1.8 of the staff orders for the public service? Mr. Speaker, let me firstly quote the section of the staff orders that has been referred to in the question. Staff orders for public service 2004, and I am assuming that the member is looking at the 2004 version. 1.8 speaks to promotion, and it says, as a general rule, selection processes for promotion opportunities should be through competition, duly conducted, and should provide fair and equitable access and opportunity to all candidates across the public service who may be interested in and eligible to apply for the position. 2, in exceptional circumstances, permanent secretaries and heads of departments may make a case for a promotion without competition. Example, where the talent pool is limited and known, or where the decision relates to the training and development strategy in the Human Resource Development Plan. In such cases, the appointment decision should be posted so that anyone who may have had an interest may exercise the right to appeal. And 3, if 2 or more candidates were assessed to be equally suitable, then seniority may be used to determine the most suitable candidate. Mr. Speaker, the staff orders does allow the permanent secretary or appropriate officers to appoint someone in certain circumstances. 2 individuals expressed interest to the permanent secretary, and both were considered. Both would have had the requisite and relevant experience to qualify for the post. 1 person subsequently took up another employment opportunity. The decision to appoint Mrs. Campbell to the position rested on 1, there is a policy consideration for the reform of the CDF. We should note that the CDF is still being treated as a temporary project and is probably the only public service project in which a parliamentary committee has a form of operational oversight. Therefore, a part of the consideration that should be raised here in this House is to how to institutionalize and rationalize the CDF to bring it under the permanent establishment. So, Mr. Speaker, it's a very important point that the CDF is not part of the public service establishment. 2, Mr. Speaker, you would also agree that in the current context of rationalization, any such move that is to make the CDF a permanent part of the public service establishment would have to consider ensuring that there are no redundancies and that there are efficiencies and synergies realized when that kind of permanency is created. Mr. Speaker, when we consider that there are already other government programs that do things that are similar to what the CDF does, when we bring it onto the institutional establishment, we would have to consider how we rationalize, how we look for shared services, and how we ensure that there are no redundancies. Mr. Speaker, with the consideration of major reforms, it made strategic sense not to engage a long-term contract until the reform process is settled. With that in mind, Mr. Speaker, twice we extended the contract of the former director of the CDF for a period totaling 1 year and 4 months. As the minister responsible for the CDF, I am still pursuing the reforms, but given the nature of the CDF, general consultations would have to be had with all stakeholders, and in this case, Mr. Speaker, the stakeholders would have to be the members of Parliament. With the reform agenda not yet complete, the decision was taken to have a temporary appointment for a period of 6 months until the proposals for the reform of the CDF are finalized. Mrs. Campbell was therefore engaged in this capacity, and her appointment was made public in keeping with Section 1(8), and of course, no one appealed. So if you read 1(8), it says you have to make it public. No one appealed. But outside of that, important to note that the appointment is only transitional, and it is for 6 months. 3, if the answer to 2 is in the affirmative, kindly give details as to when and where. 3, asking if the job was advertised. And Mr. Speaker, just to be clear, 1(8) doesn't speak to advertising. It speaks to a competitive process. Advertising, of course, is one form of a competitive process. How many persons applied for the position? Again, Mr. Speaker, we couldn't say that there were applications from an advertising process. 2 persons expressed interest to the permanent secretary. Was a shortlist prepared? Again, Mr. Speaker, 2 persons expressed interest. And 6, were interviews conducted. As I said, Mr. Speaker, 1 person pulled out because they got another job. So there was no need to conduct a competitive interview. How was Ms. Kedisha Campbell selected to fill the position? 2 persons, both of whom have experience related to the CDF, expressed interest to the permanent secretary and were considered. However, one of the individuals took up another offer and therefore was no longer available for consideration. Ms. Campbell was selected based upon her specific experience and qualification in line with training and development strategies. Ms. Campbell has over 10 years relevant experience regarding CDF operations. She is also aware of the plans and policy directions for the reform of the CDF. She holds a Bachelor's of Arts degree in Political Science and History, a postgraduate diploma in General Management, and is pursuing her Master's in Project Management, which she will finish in 2019. She is therefore qualified to fill the role, but she is now in only a transitional contract. Ms. Kedisha Campbell is known previously to the Prime Minister, and in what capacity? Ms. Campbell was previously engaged on contract as a technical assistant to the support unit of the Office of the Prime Minister. Mrs. Campbell also served as the Special Technical Assistant at the Ministry of Education and the Office of the Leader of the Opposition, formerly and never again. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, a couple of questions. Based on the Prime Minister's response, the position was not actually advertised. So I would like to know, how would the 2 persons have known of the vacancy and would have been in a position to express that interest to the permanent secretary, one. Secondly, the Prime Minister has indicated that it's a transitional post for a 6-month period, appointment for a 6-month period. What happens at the end of the 6-month period if the reforms that you are proposing have not been completed? Is it an automatic extension? Is she evaluated? What happens at the end of the period? And then the third point I want to make, which is really less about the individual and more about the process. And I think it's actually timely that we're discussing this before your statement on Petrojam, because I want to make a link between the lack of competitiveness in how persons are selected for jobs in the public sector and the link to corruption. And once the investigations in Petrojam, the Universal Service Fund, and NESOL emerge, you will find that a significant part of what has contributed to the problem is that people have been put in positions without, even where they are advertised, without a transparent and open process. And because they have been put in these positions, they have felt beholden to the persons who have put them in positions and have done things which have breached government guidelines. And I think there is a principle that we need to be cautious about in how we adopt in many of these agencies a non-competitive approach to positions that require competition and where we should have the best and the brightest minds.
Mr. Speaker, let me say that the member's concern is valid and that I want it to be appreciated that from this side, the government of the day supports, endorses, and follows the guidelines set out for the staff orders for public service. And there's no intention on our side to in any way flout, pervert, or go around these staff orders. And I want to, which is why I read it out, because it's important that it be said in Parliament, that the general rule is that competitive